She was 19 years old when her own father sold her to a stranger for $800 in gold. In a smoke-filled Montana saloon, Clara Wynne watched the man everyone called a monster step out of the shadows and claim her as his. They said Harlan Drake was a savage, a beast, a man who spoke to wolves and buried bodies in the mountains. But what Clara discovered in his cabin would shatter everything she believed about monsters and about love itself. Stay with me until the very end of this story and drop a comment telling me which city you're watching from. I want to see just how far Clara's journey has traveled across this world. The winter of 1887 came early to Copper Ridge, Montana. Snow fell in thick, silent sheets across the valley, blanketing the wooden storefronts and muddy roads in a layer of deceptive purity. The mountains rose like ancient sentinels in the distance, their peaks lost in clouds so heavy they seemed to press down on the earth itself. It was the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and made you question whether spring would ever come again. Clara Wynne pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stood at the window of their rented room above the general store. Her breath fogged the glass, and she traced a small heart in the condensation, a childish habit she'd never quite outgrown. At 19 years old, Clara had already learned that hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. But still, she drew her little hearts. Still, she dreamed. "Clara," her father's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Get yourself dressed proper. We're going to the saloon." She turned slowly, her hazel eyes meeting the bloodshot gaze of Samuel Wynne. He stood in the doorway, his clothes rumpled, his graying hair unwashed, his hands trembling with the familiar shake of a man who needed whiskey more than he needed air. "The saloon, Papa?" Clara's voice was soft, careful. She'd learned long ago not to provoke him. "It's nearly dark. The snow—" "Did I ask for your opinion, girl?" Samuel crossed the room in 3 unsteady steps and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. "You'll do as you're told. Put on your mother's blue dress, the one with the lace." Clara's heart sank. Her mother's blue dress. She only wore that dress when her father wanted something, when he needed to present her like merchandise at an auction. The last time had been in Billings, when he tried to arrange a marriage with a 50-year-old widower who smelled of tobacco and looked at Clara like she was a piece of meat. She'd escaped that fate only because the widower had died of apoplexy 3 days before the wedding. "Papa, please," she whispered. "Whatever debt you owe, there must be another way." The slap came without warning, snapping her head to the side and leaving a burning imprint on her cheek. Clara didn't cry out. She'd stopped crying out years ago. "Another way?" Samuel laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "There is no other way, you stupid girl. Do you think I'd be dragging you to that godforsaken saloon if there was another way? Now get dressed. We leave in 10 minutes. He released her arm and stumbled back toward the door, pausing only to grab the half-empty bottle of whiskey from the nightstand. Clara watched him go, her hand pressed against her stinging cheek, her heart pounding with a fear she couldn't name. She knew somehow that tonight would change everything. The Silver Strike Saloon sat at the edge of Copper Ridge like a rotting tooth in an otherwise healthy mouth. It was a place of shadows and secrets where men came to forget their troubles and women came to survive. The piano player, a one-eyed man named Dutch, pounded out the same 3 songs over and over, his fingers moving mechanically across yellowed keys. Smoke hung thick in the air, mixing with the smell of cheap whiskey, unwashed bodies, and desperation. Clara kept her eyes down as her father guided her through the crowded room. She could feel the stares of the men, hungry, appraising, calculating. In her mother's blue dress, with her honey-brown hair pinned up and her cheeks still flushed from the cold, she knew she looked beautiful. And in a place like this, beauty was currency. "Samuel Wynne!" a voice boomed across the saloon, and Clara looked up to see a large man rising from a poker table in the corner. He was well dressed for Copper Ridge, a brocade vest, a gold watch chain, polished boots. But his eyes were cold, calculating, the eyes of a predator. "Mr. Blackwood," Samuel's voice had taken on that oily, obsequious tone Clara hated. "I brought what I promised." The man, Blackwood, approached them slowly, his gaze traveling over Clara's body with undisguised interest. She forced herself not to flinch, not to show fear. Men like this fed on fear. "Well, well," Blackwood murmured, circling her like a buyer examining a horse. "You weren't lying, Wynne. She is a pretty thing." He reached out and lifted a strand of Clara's hair, rubbing it between his fingers. "Clean, too. That's rare enough in this town." "She's educated," Samuel added eagerly. "Can read and write. Do figures. Her mother was a schoolteacher before she passed." "Is that so?" Blackwood smiled, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "An educated whore. How novel." Clara's stomach turned, but she kept her face blank, her voice steady. "I am no one's whore, sir." The slap came from her father this time, harder than before, hard enough to split her lip. Blood welled up, hot and metallic, against her tongue. "You'll speak when spoken to, girl," Samuel hissed. Then, to Blackwood, "Forgive her, sir. She doesn't know her place yet. But she'll learn. They always learn." Blackwood laughed, a low, ugly sound. "Oh, I do enjoy breaking the spirited ones." He pulled a leather pouch from his vest and tossed it to Samuel. $500, as agreed. She'll work off the rest at my establishment in Helena." Clara's blood ran cold. Helena. She knew what establishments operated in Helena. She'd heard the stories of girls who went there and were never seen again, or if they were hollow-eyed shadows of their former selves, addicted to laudanum and broken beyond repair. "Papa," she whispered, grabbing her father's arm. "Papa, please, don't do this. I'll work. I'll find a position as a governess, a seamstress, anything. Please don't sell me to this man." For just a moment, just one fleeting second, she saw something flicker in her father's eyes. Guilt, perhaps. Or shame. The ghost of the man he'd been before her mother died, before the whiskey consumed him, before he'd gambled away everything they owned. But then the moment passed, and Samuel Wynne shook off his daughter's hand like she was nothing more than an inconvenience. "The deal is done, Clara. Accept your fate." Blackwood grabbed her arm, his grip bruising, his breath hot against her ear. "Come along, pretty thing. We have a long journey ahead of us, and I'd like to sample the merchandise before we leave." Clara's vision blurred with tears she refused to shed. This was it, then, the end of everything. She would disappear into Helena's underworld, and no one would know or care. Her mother was dead. Her father had sold her. She had no one. She closed her eyes and sent up a silent prayer to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. And that's when the door of the saloon crashed open. The man who stood in the doorway was unlike anyone Clara had ever seen. He was enormous, easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to block out the howling wind behind him. His hair was long and dark, streaked with gray at the temples, and his beard was thick and wild. He wore a coat made of animal pelts, heavy boots caked with snow, and at his hip hung a hunting knife that looked capable of gutting a grizzly bear, but it was his eyes that made Clara's breath catch in her throat. They were gray, pale gray, like winter storm clouds, like the mountains themselves. And they held a depth of pain, of solitude, of ancient, unspeakable sorrow that made her heart ache for reasons she couldn't understand. The saloon fell silent. Even Dutch stopped playing, his fingers frozen above the piano keys. Every man in the room seemed to shrink back, as if the stranger carried death itself in his wake. "Jesus Christ," someone whispered. "It's Drake." "The mountain man. I thought he was dead." "He killed 3 men in Butte, I heard. Tore them apart with his bare hands." Clara watched as the man, Drake, scanned the room with those unsettling gray eyes. His gaze passed over the poker tables, the bar, the frightened faces of the saloon's patrons, and then it landed on her. She couldn't look away. It was like being pinned by the stare of a wolf, terrifying and mesmerizing in equal measure. She expected to see violence in those eyes, or cruelty, or the cold indifference of a predator. Instead, she saw recognition. It made no sense. She'd never met this man, never even seen him before tonight. But something in his gaze suggested he knew her, or perhaps that he'd been looking for her without even knowing it. "Harlan Drake," Blackwood's voice had lost its confident edge. "What brings you down from your mountain? Run out of wolves to talk to?" Drake said nothing. He simply walked forward, his heavy boots thudding against the wooden floor, his presence parting the crowd like Moses parting the Red Sea. Men scrambled to get out of his way, knocking over chairs and spilling drinks in their haste. He stopped directly in front of Clara and Blackwood, towering over them both. Up close, she could see the scars that crisscrossed his face and hands, the marks of a man who had fought the wilderness and won. She could smell pine and wood smoke and something wild, something untamed. "Let her go." His voice was low and rough, like gravel sliding over stone. It was the voice of a man who rarely spoke, who had forgotten how to make pleasant conversation, who used words only when absolutely necessary. Blackwood laughed nervously. "Now, Drake, let's not be hasty. This is a legal transaction. The girl's father sold her to me, fair and square." "I don't care." Drake reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch, much larger than the one Blackwood had given Samuel. He tossed it onto the nearest table, and gold coins spilled out, glittering in the lamplight. $800, more than you paid." Clara's heart stopped. $800 was a fortune. It was more money than her father had seen in his entire miserable life. It was enough to buy a house, a farm, a future. And this stranger, this terrifying mountain man who spoke to wolves and killed men with his bare hands, was offering it for her. "Drake, be reasonable," Blackwood tried again, but his voice had gone thin with fear. "The girl is mine. I have plans for her." "Your plans don't matter." Drake took a step closer, and Blackwood flinched back as if struck. "The girl comes with me. Take the money and walk away. Or don't take the money, and I'll bury you in the mountains where no one will ever find you." It wasn't a threat. It was a simple statement of fact, delivered with the calm certainty of a man who had made such statements before, and followed through on them. For a long, terrible moment, no one moved. Claire could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, could feel the tension in the room like a physical weight pressing down on her chest. Then Blackwood released her arm. "Fine," he spat, grabbing the pouch of gold from the table. "Take her. She's not worth dying over." He turned to Samuel Wynne, who was standing frozen by the bar, his face pale with shock. "You owe me, Wynne. Don't think I'll forget this." Samuel said nothing. He didn't even look at his daughter as Blackwood stormed out of the saloon, his hired men scrambling after him. Clara stood alone in the middle of the room, trembling, bleeding from her split lip, wearing her dead mother's blue dress. She looked up at the man who had just bought her for $800 in gold, and she waited for him to claim his prize. Instead, Drake shrugged off his heavy coat and draped it around her shoulders. The weight of it was comforting, warm, and it smelled of pine needles and wood smoke. He didn't touch her beyond that, didn't grab her arm, didn't force her to move, didn't treat her like property. "Can you walk?" he asked, his voice still rough but somehow gentler now. Clara nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "Good." He turned toward the door, then paused and looked back at her. "My wagon's outside. You'll ride in the back, under the canvas. It's warmer there." He started walking, and Clara followed. She didn't know why. She didn't understand what was happening or what this man wanted from her. But something deep in her gut, some ancient primal instinct, told her that Harlan Drake, for all his terrifying reputation, was not the monster everyone believed him to be. And she had nothing left to lose. They left Copper Ridge as the snow began to fall in earnest, fat white flakes swirling in the darkness like lost souls searching for home. Clara huddled in the back of Drake's wagon, wrapped in his enormous coat surrounded by supplies, flour, sugar, coffee, bolts of fabric, books. So many books. She picked one up, squinting at the title in the dim light filtering through the canvas, The Complete Works of William Shakespeare. A mountain man who read Shakespeare. The wagon jolted over a rut in the road, and Clara clutched the book to her chest, her mind racing. What had she gotten herself into? Who was this man, really? The townspeople had whispered of murder, of savagery, of a hermit who lived alone in the mountains with wolves as his only companions. They said he'd gone mad after some tragedy, that he spoke to the dead, that he was more animal than human. But animals didn't read Shakespeare. Animals didn't offer their coats to frightened girls. Animals didn't pay $800 for someone's freedom. Freedom, she thought. Is that what this is? She wanted to believe it. God, how she wanted to believe it. But experience had taught her that nothing in this world came without a price. Drake had bought her. He owned her now, just as surely as Blackwood would have. The only question was what he intended to do with her. The wagon rolled on through the night, climbing higher into the mountains. Clara drifted in and out of an uneasy sleep, jerking awake every time the wheels hit a rock or the horses snorted. She dreamed of her mother, beautiful, gentle Margaret Wynne, who had died of consumption when Clara was 12 years old. She dreamed of her father, the man he'd been before grief and whiskey destroyed him. She dreamed of a different life, one where she'd grown up safe and loved, where she'd married for affection rather than survival. When she woke, the wagon had stopped. Clara sat up, pushing aside the canvas flap, and gasped. They were high in the mountains now, higher than she'd ever been. The snow had stopped, and the sky had cleared to reveal a tapestry of stars so bright, so numerous, that it hurt to look at them. The moon hung low and full, casting silver light over a landscape of pristine white. Snow-covered pines, frozen streams, mountains that rose like cathedral spires toward the heavens. And nestled in a small valley, surrounded by those ancient trees, was a cabin. It was larger than Clara had expected. 2 stories, with a stone chimney that breathed silver smoke into the night air. Warm light glowed in the windows, and a covered porch wrapped around the front, sheltering stacks of firewood and what looked like hand-carved furniture. "We're here," Drake said, appearing at the back of the wagon. His voice made her jump. She hadn't heard him approach. He extended a hand to help her down, and after a moment's hesitation, Clara took it. His palm was rough with calluses, his grip strong but careful, and he released her the moment her feet touched the ground. "It's beautiful," she heard herself say, and was surprised to find that she meant it. Drake made a sound that might have been agreement, or might have been dismissal. He was already moving toward the cabin, carrying supplies from the wagon, with the easy strength of a man accustomed to hard labor. Clara followed, her borrowed boots crunching in the snow, her heart beating an uncertain rhythm against her ribs. The cabin's front door opened onto a large main room, a living area with comfortable chairs arranged before a stone fireplace, a kitchen with iron pots hanging from hooks on the ceiling, a wooden table set with 2 chairs. 2 chairs. As if he'd been expecting someone. The fire was burning low, casting dancing shadows across the walls. Clara noticed the decorations immediately. They were impossible to miss. Hand-carved wooden figurines lined the mantelpiece, birds, deer, wolves, a bear standing on its hind legs, a pair of rabbits nestled together. The detail was exquisite, each piece clearly crafted with patience and love. There were also quilts, draped over the chairs, folded on a shelf, spread across what looked like a bed visible through an open doorway. They were beautiful, intricate patterns of color that seemed out of place in a bachelor's mountain cabin. "There's soup on the stove," Drake said, breaking the silence. "You should eat, then sleep. The bedroom is through there." He gestured toward the doorway Clara had noticed. "I'll take the floor out here." Clara blinked. "The floor? But this is your home." "You're my guest." He said it firmly, brooking no argument. "Guests don't sleep on floors." "I'm not your guest," Clara heard herself say. "You bought me. I'm your property." The word tasted bitter on her tongue, but she forced herself to say it. She needed to understand the terms of her captivity. She needed to know what was expected of her. Drake turned to look at her then, really look at her, and something in his gray eyes made her breath catch. It wasn't anger or lust or cruelty. It was something far more complicated, something that looked almost like shame. "I didn't buy you," he said quietly. "I bought your freedom. There's a difference." Clara shook her head, not understanding. "But the money was to get you away from that man, from what he would have done to you." Drake's jaw tightened, and for the first time Clara saw a flash of the violence everyone whispered about, not directed at her, but at the memory of Blackwood and his establishment in Helena. "I know what happens to girls who go to places like that. I couldn't let it happen again." Again. The word hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Clara wanted to ask, wanted to understand, but something told her that tonight was not the time. "So I'm free to go?" she asked instead. "If I wanted to leave, you wouldn't stop me." Drake was silent for a long moment. Then he crossed to the fireplace and added another log, the flames leaping up to embrace it. "You're free to go," he said finally, his back still turned. "But where would you go?" "Back to your father. Back to Copper Ridge where Blackwood's men might find you. Into the mountains alone, in winter, with no supplies and no knowledge of the terrain." He turned to face her, and his expression was unreadable. "You can leave whenever you want, Clara Wynne, but I hope you'll stay, at least until spring, at least until it's safe." Clara's name on his lips sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. She hadn't told him her name. He must have heard it in the saloon, filed it away in that quiet, watchful mind of his. "Why?" she whispered. "Why do you care what happens to me?" Drake didn't answer immediately. He stood by the fire, his massive frame silhouetted against the flames, his face half in shadow. When he spoke, his voice was so low she had to strain to hear it. "Because someone should." And then he walked past her, out into the cold night, leaving Clara alone in the warm cabin with more questions than she'd ever had in her life. She found the soup, venison stew, thick and rich and fragrant with herbs, and ate 2 bowls before her stomach told her to stop. She found clean water in a pitcher by the wash basin and cleaned the blood from her split lip, wincing at the sting. She found the bedroom Drake had indicated and stood in the doorway for a long moment, staring at the bed within. It was a proper bed, with a wooden frame and a mattress stuffed with what felt like goose down. The quilts were piled high, inviting, warm. On the nightstand sat a candle, a book of poetry, and a small vase holding dried wildflowers. This was not the den of a monster. Clara undressed slowly, her fingers clumsy with exhaustion and residual fear. She folded her mother's blue dress carefully and set it on a chair, then slipped beneath the quilts in just her chemise. The sheets smelled of lavender. Someone had tucked sachets between the folds. Who was Harlan Drake? What had happened to him to drive him to this solitary existence? And why had he rescued her from a fate worse than death, only to ask nothing in return? The questions swirled through her mind as sleep claimed her, pulling her down into darkness. Her last conscious thought was of gray eyes, winter storm clouds, and the unexpected gentleness of a monster's hands. Clara woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of birdsong. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. The ceiling above her was unfamiliar, the bed too soft, the air too clean. Then the memories came flooding back. The saloon, Blackwood's hands on her, her father's betrayal, the mountain man who had paid $800 for her freedom, and she sat up with a gasp. Sunlight streamed through the window, painting golden rectangles on the wooden floor. Through the glass, Clara could see a world transformed, snow sparkling like diamonds under a brilliant blue sky, mountains rising in majestic silence, pine trees bowed under their white burden. It was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. She dressed quickly in her mother's blue dress, she had nothing else, and ventured out into the main room. Drake was there, sitting at the wooden table with a cup of coffee and a leather-bound book. He looked up when she entered and something flickered across his face, surprise perhaps, or appreciation. "You're awake," he said, stating the obvious in that gruff, economical way of his. "Yes." Clara hovered near the bedroom doorway, uncertain of her welcome. Thank you for the bed and the soup." Drake nodded, then gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Sit. There's more coffee and bread. You need to eat." She sat, wrapping her hands around the cup of coffee he poured for her, savoring the warmth that seeped into her cold fingers. The bread was fresh, homemade, she realized, studying the uneven crust. This man, this terrifying mountain hermit, baked his own bread. "Do you have questions?" Drake asked suddenly, not looking up from his book. Clara almost laughed. Did she have questions? She had nothing but questions. "Why did you save me?" she asked, choosing the most pressing one. "And please don't say because someone should. I want a real answer." Drake was silent for so long that Clara thought he wouldn't respond. Then he closed his book. She caught a glimpse of the title, Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, and set it aside. 12 years ago, he said slowly, as if each word cost him something, I had a wife. Her name was Eliza. Clara's breath caught. She hadn't expected this. A confession, an explanation, a window into the mystery of Harlan Drake. She was everything. His voice had dropped to a whisper, and his gray eyes were distant, focused on something Clara couldn't see. Kind, brave, beautiful. She could make me laugh, which isn't easy. She could make me believe that life was worth living, which is even harder. He paused, and Clara watched a muscle twitch in his jaw, the only visible sign of the emotion raging beneath his stoic surface. We were going to have a child, a daughter. Eliza was certain it would be a girl. She'd already picked out a name, Loretta, after her grandmother. She was 7 months along when Iki stopped, swallowed hard, and when he continued, his voice was rough as sandpaper. When they came. Who? Claire whispered, afraid to speak louder, afraid to break whatever spell had loosened Drake's tongue. Outlaws. A gang passing through. They found our cabin while I was out hunting. By the time I got back... He closed his eyes, and Clara saw his hands clench into fists on the tabletop. By the time I got back, it was too late. They'd taken everything, done things I won't speak of, and then they'd killed her and the baby both. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. She'd expected cruelty, violence, madness. She hadn't expected this, a tragedy so profound, so devastating, that it explained everything. The solitude, the reputation, the wolves. I tracked them down, Drake continued, his voice flat now, emotionless. All 7 of them. It took me 2 years, but I found every single one, and I made them pay. The 3 men in Butte, Clara breathed, remembering the whispers in the saloon. Among others. He opened his eyes and looked at her, and Clara saw something new in those gray depths. Not just pain, but purpose. After that, I came back here. Built this cabin on the ruins of the old one. I swore I'd never let anyone close again, never risk that kind of loss again. Then why did I save you? He smiled then, a small, sad smile that transformed his weathered face. Because you looked at me. In that saloon, when everyone else was looking away, you looked right at me. And I saw her. Not Eliza, you don't look like her. But I saw the same spirit, the same fire, the same refusal to be broken. He reached across the table and very gently touched Clara's hand. I couldn't save my wife, he said softly. I couldn't save my daughter. But I could save you. So I did. Clara's tears spilled over then, running down her cheeks unchecked. She didn't try to hide them, didn't try to pretend she wasn't moved by this man's terrible history and unexpected kindness. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry for what happened to you. Drake withdrew his hand and shook his head. Don't be sorry, just be alive. Be free. That's all I ask. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling, the coffee cooling, the weight of shared sorrow settling around them like a blanket. And somehow, in that silence, something shifted between them. An understanding, a connection, a fragile bridge built across the chasm of their separate pains. The days that followed were strange and quiet. Drake kept his distance, sleeping on the floor by the fire as promised, spending his days chopping wood, checking animal traps, and venturing into the forest for hours at a time. He spoke little, but when he did, his words were thoughtful, measured, surprisingly eloquent. Clara, for her part, tried to make herself useful. She cleaned the cabin, though it was already cleaner than any bachelor's home had a right to be. She cooked meals from the supplies Drake had brought from town, discovering a modest talent for turning simple ingredients into something palatable. She mended a tear in one of the quilts and reorganized the bookshelves by author's last name. And she read. God, how she read. Drake's collection was eclectic and extensive, Shakespeare and Shelley, Austen and Dickens, Thoreau and Emerson, history books and philosophy texts, volumes of poetry and scientific treatises. Clara devoured them all, curled up in a chair by the fire, while Drake whittled wooden figurines at the table or stared into the flames with those distant gray eyes. Sometimes, in the evenings, he would read aloud. His voice, so rough and hesitant in conversation, transformed when he read Shakespeare. He gave each character a distinct voice, a personality, a soul. Clara would close her eyes and let the words wash over her, transported to Verona, to the forest of Arden, to Elsinore's haunted halls. To be or not to be, Drake read one night, his voice low and resonant. That is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing, end them. Clara opened her eyes and found him watching her, the book forgotten in his lap. Do you believe that? She asked. That opposing our troubles can end them? Drake considered the question, his brow furrowed in thought.
I believe we have a choice, he said finally. Suffer in silence or fight for something better, Eliza. She was a fighter. Until the very end. So are you, Clara said quietly. You fought for me. Something passed across Drake's face. Surprise, perhaps, or gratitude, or some emotion he couldn't name. He cleared his throat and looked away.
You should sleep, he said gruffly. Storm's coming. We'll be snowed in by morning. Clara rose, gathering the blanket she'd been using around her shoulders. At the bedroom door, she paused and looked back. Harlan? It was the first time she'd used his given name. He looked up, startled. Thank you, she said, for everything, for the books, for the reading, for making me feel like a person again instead of a thing to be bought and sold. Drake said nothing, but his gray eyes softened, and Clara thought she saw moisture gathering there. Tears he would never shed, at least not in front of her. Good night, Clara, he said at last. Good night, Harlan. She went to bed with a strange warmth in her chest, and for the first time since her mother died, Clara Wynne fell asleep without fear. The storm Drake had predicted arrived with a vengeance. For 3 days, snow fell in unrelenting sheets, piling against the cabin walls until the windows were nearly buried. The wind howled like a wounded animal, rattling the shutters, finding its way through every tiny crack in the chinked logs. The temperature plummeted, and even with the fire burning constantly, frost formed on the inside of the windows. Clara and Drake were trapped, together, alone, with nowhere to go and nothing to do but learn each other. It was strange, this forced intimacy. Clara had grown up in households full of noise and chaos. Even after her mother died, there had been her father's drunken rants, the clatter of boarding houses, the bustle of whatever town they happened to be passing through. Silence was foreign to her, and she'd expected it to be uncomfortable. Instead, she found it peaceful. Drake was an easy presence, undemanding, unobtrusive, content to share space without filling it with meaningless chatter. He taught her to play chess, she was terrible, and cards, she was worse, and showed her how to carve simple shapes from scraps of wood. She was hopeless, but he was patient. In return, she taught him songs her mother had sung, taught him card games her father had learned in saloons before he'd become the man he was now. And they talked. Slowly, haltingly, they talked. Drake told her about his childhood in Vermont, about the father who'd taught him to hunt and the mother who'd taught him to read. He told her about coming west as a young man, full of dreams of gold and adventure, about meeting Eliza at a barn dance in Sacramento and knowing, in that single moment, that he'd found his home. Clara told him about her mother, about Margaret Wynne's gentle hands and quiet strength, about the books she'd read aloud every night before bed, about the way she'd fought consumption with everything she had until there was simply nothing left to fight with. She told him about watching her father crumble after Margaret's death, about the gambling and the drinking and the slow, terrible slide into the man who would sell his own daughter to pay his debts. "Do you hate him?" Drake asked one evening as the storm raged outside and the fire crackled between them. "Your father?" Clara considered the question for a long moment. "I want to," she admitted. "Part of me does. But mostly I just feel sad. He wasn't always like this. When my mother was alive, he was kind. Funny. He used to carry me on his shoulders and call me his little princess." She laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Hard to believe now." "Grief changes people," Drake said quietly. "Sometimes it breaks them." "Is that what happened to you? Did grief break you?" Drake was silent for so long that Clara thought she'd overstepped. Then he sighed, a deep, weary sound that seemed to come from somewhere far away. "For a while," he admitted. "After Eliza and the baby, I didn't want to live. I thought about ending it more than once. But then I'd think about the men who'd done this, and I'd decide I needed to stay alive long enough to make them pay. Revenge kept me going when nothing else could. And after, when they were all dead, after..." He looked into the fire and the flames reflected in his gray eyes, turning them to molten silver. "After, I had to find a new reason. So I came back here, built this cabin, made a life such as it is. The wolves help." Clara blinked. "The wolves?" Drake smiled.
A real smile this time, one that crinkled the corners of his eyes and softened his whole face. "You'll meet them soon enough. They're family, of a sort.
The only kind I thought I'd ever have again." Clara wanted to ask more, but a gust of wind rattled the cabin walls, and the moment was lost. Drake rose to add another log to the fire, and they fell into companionable silence once more. But that night, as Clara lay in her warm bed listening to the storm rage outside, she found herself thinking about wolves and family, and the strange, wounded man who had given her both shelter and hope. And she found herself wondering if, perhaps, she could be a reason for him too. On the fourth day, the storm broke. Clara woke to silence, a profound, absolute silence that seemed to press against her ears after days of howling wind. She dressed quickly and rushed out into the main room where Drake was already pulling on his heavy coat and boots. "The snow's stopped," he said, stating the obvious. "I need to check the traps, clear the path to the barn, make sure the horses survived. Can I come with you?" The words were out before Clara could think better of them. "I've been inside for so long, I feel like I'm going mad." Drake hesitated, then nodded. "Dress warm. Wear these." He handed her a pair of thick wool pants and a heavy sweater. "Your dress is useless in the deep snow." Clara took the clothes without comment, though her cheeks flushed slightly at the intimacy of wearing his garments. She changed quickly in the bedroom, rolling up the pants legs and cinching the sweater with a leather belt. When she emerged, Drake looked her over with an expression she couldn't read. "You look like a proper mountain woman," he said finally, and Clara thought she detected a hint of approval in his gruff voice. They stepped outside into a world transformed. The snow was waist-deep in places, higher where the wind had created drifts against the cabin walls and outbuildings. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and the sun reflecting off the white landscape was almost blinding. The air was crisp, clean, and cold, so cold that Clara's breath crystallized the moment it left her lips, hanging in the air like tiny diamonds before dissipating. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "It's dangerous," Drake corrected, but there was no harshness in his tone. "This much snow, this cold, it kills people who aren't careful. Stay close to me." Clara nodded and fell into step behind him as he began breaking a path through the drifts. It was hard work, exhausting work, and within minutes her legs were burning and her lungs ached from the cold air. But she didn't complain, didn't ask to go back inside. She was free, truly free, for the first time in her life, and she intended to experience every moment of it. They reached the barn without incident. The horses were cold but unharmed, and Clara helped Drake bring in fresh water and hay. They checked the animal traps next, finding 2 rabbits and a fox, which Drake dispatched quickly and humanely. Clara looked away during the killing, but forced herself to watch as he dressed the animals, understanding that this knowledge might one day save her life. "You're learning," Drake observed, his tone neutral but somehow approving. "I have a good teacher." He glanced at her, and something shifted in his gray eyes, something warm, something soft. But before Clara could examine it, he turned away and began the trek back toward the cabin. That's when the wolves appeared. They came out of the forest like ghosts, silent, silver, their yellow eyes gleaming in the winter light. There were 6 of them, ranging from a massive gray male to a smaller, darker female who hung back from the group. Clara's heart leaped into her throat, and she instinctively moved closer to Drake. "Don't be afraid," he said quietly, not reaching for his knife, not showing any sign of alarm. "They won't hurt you. Harlan, watch." The big gray male approached Drake first, sniffing his outstretched hand before bumping his head against Drake's palm like an enormous dog. Drake scratched behind the wolf's ears, murmuring something too low for Clara to hear, and the animal's tail. Clara hadn't even known wolves could wag their tails, swept back and forth in obvious pleasure. One by one, the other wolves approached, each receiving a greeting from Drake, each responding with the same strange, dog-like affection. Finally, the dark female crept forward, more cautious than the rest, and stood before Clara. "This is Shadow," Drake said. "She's the Omega, the lowest-ranking member of the pack. She lost her mate last spring, and she's been different since. Quieter, more careful." Clara looked at the wolf, and the wolf looked back. There was something in those yellow eyes, something knowing, something sympathetic, as if Shadow recognized a kindred spirit. Slowly, hardly daring to breathe, Clara extended her hand. Shadow sniffed it, her cold nose brushing Clara's fingers. Then, incredibly, she pressed her head against Clara's palm and closed her eyes. "She likes you," Drake said, and there was wonder in his voice, as if this were something he hadn't expected, something rare and precious. "That's unusual. She doesn't trust easily." "Neither do I," Clara whispered, her fingers buried in Shadow's thick fur. "Maybe that's why we understand each other." They stood there for a long moment, man, woman, and wolves, in the frozen silence of the Montana wilderness. And Clara thought, with sudden, startling clarity, "This is where I belong." Whoa. The weeks that followed were the strangest and most wonderful of Clara's life. She learned the rhythms of the mountain, learned to read the weather and the color of the sky and the behavior of the animals, learned to track deer through snow and recognize edible plants beneath the winter frost. She learned to shoot, badly at first, then better, to set traps, to skin and butcher game. She learned to bake bread almost as good as Drake's, to patch her own clothes, to bank a fire so it would last through the night. And she learned Harlan Drake. She learned that he talked to the wolves because they were the only ones who listened without judgment. She learned that he carved figurines to calm his mind, that reading aloud helped him remember Eliza's voice, that he still woke sometimes in the grip of nightmares so terrible they left him shaking and silent for hours afterward. She learned that he was gentle with animals and harsh with himself, that he carried guilt for his wife's death like a physical weight, that he believed, truly believed, he didn't deserve happiness or love or any of the ordinary human connections most people took for granted. And she learned, slowly and inexorably, that she was falling in love with him. It crept up on her like the spring that was slowly approaching, imperceptible at first, then suddenly, overwhelmingly present. It was in the way her heart lifted when she heard his heavy footsteps on the porch. It was in the way she found excuses to brush against him, to stand close to him, to watch him when she thought he wasn't looking. It was in the warmth that spread through her chest when he smiled at something she'd said, or laughed at one of her terrible jokes, or looked at her with those gray eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. She didn't tell him. How could she? He'd made it clear that he'd saved her from a sense of duty, not attraction. He'd made it clear that his heart belonged to a dead woman and an unborn daughter. He'd made it clear that he was broken, beyond repair, unworthy of love. But Clara couldn't help herself. She loved him anyway. And as the snow began to melt and the first hints of spring appeared in the valley, she knew that her time in Harlan Drake's cabin was coming to an end. He'd offered her sanctuary until spring, until it was safe. And spring was almost here. "You should start thinking about where you want to go." Drake's voice broke through Clara's reverie as they sat before the fire one evening. She looked up from her book, her heart suddenly pounding. "What?" "When the pass is clear, you'll be able to travel again." He wasn't looking at her. His eyes were fixed on the carving in his hands, a delicate wooden bird that was slowly taking shape. "I have some money saved, enough to get you to San Francisco maybe, or back east if you prefer. You could start fresh, make a new life." Clara set her book aside, her hands trembling. "Is that what you want? For me to leave?" Drake was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough, strained. "It doesn't matter what I want. This was always meant to be temporary. A refuge, not a home." "What if I don't want to leave?" The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Drake's hand stilled on the carving, and slowly, very slowly, he looked up at her. "Clara, I know what you're going to say." She rose from her chair and crossed the room, kneeling before him so that they were eye to eye. "You're going to tell me that I deserve better than a broken mountain man who talks to wolves and lives in the wilderness. You're going to tell me that you have nothing to offer, that your heart is buried in a grave somewhere, that you're not capable of loving again." "Those things are true." His voice was barely a whisper. "No, they're not." Clara reached up and cupped his face in her hands, feeling the roughness of his beard, the tension in his jaw. "I've seen you, Harlan. The real you. Not the monster the town whispers about, but the man who cooks soup for frightened girls and reads Shakespeare by firelight and cries over wooden figurines when he thinks no one's watching." She saw him flinch. She'd touched a nerve, but she pressed on.
I've seen your heart, and it's not broken. It's healing. Slowly, yes. Painfully, yes. But it's healing.
And She took a deep breath, summoning all her courage. I want to be part of that healing. I want to stay with you. Not because I have nowhere else to go, but because there's nowhere else I want to be. Drake stared at her, his gray eyes wide with something that might have been hope and might have been fear. His hands came up to cover hers, warm and rough and trembling. You don't know what you're saying, he managed. I can't be what you need. You already are. Clara leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his. You already are, Harlan. You just don't see it yet. For a long, breathless moment, neither of them moved. The fire crackled. The wind whispered against the windows. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, a long, mournful sound that seemed to carry all the loneliness and longing in the world. And then, slowly, reverently, Harlan Drake kissed Clara Wynne. It was a gentle kiss, tentative and tender, the kiss of a man who had forgotten how. But Clara returned it with all the passion and certainty in her heart, and when they finally broke apart, she saw tears streaming down Harlan's weathered cheeks. I don't deserve you, he whispered. That's for me to decide, she whispered back, and I've decided. They sat together before the fire, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist, and they watched the flames dance and the shadows play across the walls of their cabin now, in the mountains of Montana. Outside, the wolves began to howl again, but this time it sounded less like mourning and more like celebration. And Clara Wynne, who had been sold for $800 in gold to a man everyone called a monster, finally understood what it meant to come home. Spring arrived in the mountains like a shy guest, uncertain of its welcome after such a brutal winter. The snow retreated inch by inch, revealing patches of dark earth and the first tentative shoots of green. Streams that had been frozen solid began to murmur and sing, carrying meltwater down from the peaks toward the valley below. The air lost its bitter edge and took on a softness, a promise of warmth to come. Clara woke each morning to birdsong now instead of howling wind, and she found herself smiling before she even opened her eyes. Everything had changed since the night she'd confessed her feelings to Harlan. Not dramatically, not obviously, he was still the same quiet, gruff mountain man who measured his words like precious coins. But there was a new tenderness between them, a careful intimacy that made Clara's heart sing. He reached for her hand when they walked through the forest. He brushed her hair back from her face when the wind tangled it. He said her name like it was a prayer, soft and reverent in the darkness of the cabin. They hadn't shared a bed yet. Harlan was old-fashioned that way, insisting that propriety mattered even in the wilderness, even when they were the only two humans for miles. But he'd moved from the floor to a makeshift cot near the fire, and sometimes, when Clara couldn't sleep, she would creep out of the bedroom and sit beside him, and they would talk in whispers until dawn painted the windows gold. She learned more about him during those midnight conversations than she had in all the weeks before. She learned that his favorite color was the blue of a summer sky just before sunset. She learned that he'd once wanted to be a teacher, before life had other plans. She learned that he still talked to Eliza sometimes, in his head, telling her about his day, asking her opinion on things, seeking her blessing for this unexpected second chance at happiness. "Does that bother you?" he asked one night, his voice uncertain. "That I still speak to her?" Clara considered the question carefully before answering. "No," she said finally. "I think it would bother me more if you didn't. She was your wife. She carried your child. That kind of love doesn't just disappear because someone dies. It becomes part of who you are." Harlan was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached out and took her hand, his rough fingers interlacing with hers. "You're remarkable, Clara Wynne." "I'm practical," she corrected with a smile. "There's a difference." "No." He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, a gesture so tender it made her breath catch. "You're remarkable, and I thank God every day that I walked into that saloon when I did." They sat together in comfortable silence after that, watching the embers glow in the fireplace, listening to the distant howl of wolves greeting the rising moon. And Clara thought, not for the first time, that she had never been happier in her entire life. The days grew longer and warmer, and with the improving weather came new challenges and opportunities. The cabin needed repairs after the harsh winter, loose shingles, a drafty window, a section of the porch that had begun to rot. Clara threw herself into the work alongside Harlan, learning to swing a hammer, to measure and cut lumber, to mix mortar for the stone chimney that needed patching. She was terrible at first. Her stitches were crooked, her measurements off, her hammer swings more likely to hit her thumb than the nail. But Harlan was patient, endlessly patient, guiding her hands, showing her the proper technique, never once laughing at her mistakes. "You're a good teacher," she told him one afternoon, as they worked side by side replacing the rotted porch boards. "You would have been a wonderful teacher if things had been different." Harlan paused, his hammer suspended mid-swing. "I used to think about it," he admitted, "back in Vermont, before I came west. There was a schoolhouse in my town, run by an old woman named Mrs. Hennessy. She used to let me help with the younger children, teaching them their letters, listening to them read. I loved it. Why didn't you pursue it?" He shrugged, resuming his work. "Gold fever, same as everyone else who came to California in those days. I thought I'd strike it rich, go back east, buy my own schoolhouse." A bitter laugh escaped him. "Instead, I found Eliza, and everything changed. She was worth more than all the gold in the Sierra Nevada." Clara set down her own hammer and moved closer to him, laying a hand on his arm. "Tell me about her. What was she like?" It was a risk, asking about Eliza. Sometimes Harlan welcomed the opportunity to remember her. Other times the memories were too painful, and he would withdraw into himself for hours. But today he smiled, a sad, fond smile that made Clara's heart ache. "She was fierce," he said. "That's the first thing I noticed about her. This tiny little woman with hair like fire and eyes like emeralds, standing up to a group of miners who were harassing a Chinese launderer. She had a broom in her hands, and she was swinging it like a weapon, telling them exactly what she thought of their behavior in language that would make a sailor blush." Clara laughed at the image. "And you fell in love on the spot?" "Not quite." Harlan's smile widened at the memory. "I fell in love 3 days later when I worked up the courage to speak to her and she told me I had the conversational skills of a particularly dull rock. She wasn't wrong." "You're not so bad," Clara protested. "I've gotten better. Eliza worked on me for years." He paused, his expression growing more serious. "She would have liked you, Clara. She would have said you were too good for me, same as I think, but she would have liked you anyway." Clara didn't know what to say to that, so she simply squeezed his arm and returned to her work. But warmth spread through her chest, and she found herself blinking back tears. That evening, after the work was done and supper had been eaten, Harlan surprised her with a gift. It was a wooden carving, not one of the figurines that lined the mantelpiece, but something larger, more elaborate. A woman, seated in a chair, a book open in her lap. The details were exquisite. The curl of her hair, the drape of her dress, the peaceful expression on her face. "It's me," Clara breathed, recognizing herself in the carved features. "I've been working on it for weeks," Harlan admitted, his voice gruff with embarrassment. "When you were sleeping or busy with other things, I wanted you to have something to remember this time, if you ever—" He trailed off, unable to complete the thought. "If I ever leave?" Clara set the carving carefully on the table and turned to face him. "Harlan, I've told you, I'm not going anywhere. I know what you said, but things change. People change. When the passes are clear and you can travel freely, you might feel differently. You might want to see cities again, meet people your own age, live a normal life instead of—" Clara silenced him with a kiss. It was bolder than any kiss they'd shared before. Not gentle or tentative, but fierce, demanding, full of all the passion and certainty she felt. Harlan made a sound of surprise against her lips. Then his arms came around her, pulling her close, and he kissed her back with equal fervor. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Clara pressed her forehead to his and spoke with absolute conviction. "I don't want cities. I don't want people my own age. I don't want a normal life. I want this. I want you. I want wolves and mountains and Shakespeare by firelight. I want to grow old in this cabin, Harlan Drake, and I want to grow old with you." Harlan's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Clara, say you believe me. Say you'll stop waiting for me to change my mind." He was silent for a long moment, and Clara could see the war playing out behind his gray eyes. Hope battling fear,
love wrestling with doubt. Then slowly he nodded. "I believe you," he said. "God help me. I believe you." She kissed him again, softer this time, sealing the promise. And when she went to bed that night, she fell asleep with the wooden carving clutched to her chest, dreaming of the future they would build together. The wolves came more frequently now that the weather had warmed. Clara had grown accustomed to their presence, even fond of them, but she was still learning the complex social dynamics that governed the pack. There was the alpha pair, Gray, the massive male who had first greeted Harlan in the snow, and his mate, a sleek silver female Harlan called Moon. There were the beta wolves, the hunters, the yearlings still learning their place, and there was Shadow, the dark Omega, who had attached herself to Clara with a devotion that surprised everyone, including Harlan. "She follows you like a dog," he observed one morning, watching as Shadow trailed Clara around the yard. "I've never seen her behave this way with anyone." Clara knelt and scratched behind Shadow's ears, earning a contented whine. "Maybe she knows I understand what it's like, to be the lowest, to be overlooked and dismissed." "You're not the lowest anymore," Harlan said quietly. "Not with me." She looked up at him, squinting against the morning sun. "Neither is she. Not as long as I'm here." The bond between woman and wolf deepened as the weeks passed. Shadow began sleeping on the porch outside Clara's window, guarding her through the night. She accompanied Clara on walks through the forest, padding silently beside her, alert to every sound and movement. She brought Clara gifts, dead rabbits mostly, which Clara learned to accept graciously despite her initial squeamishness. "She's claiming you as pack," Harlan explained, "providing for you the way wolves provide for their family. It's the highest honor she can give." Clara thought about that for a long time. Pack. Family. It was something she'd given up hoping for, something she'd assumed was lost to her forever when her mother died and her father descended into his whiskey-soaked despair. But here, in the mountains, with a scarred mountain man and a grieving wolf, she was building a family of her own. Spring deepened into early summer, and the valley exploded with life. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows in brilliant swaths of purple, yellow, and red. Birds returned from their winter migrations, filling the air with song. Deer ventured out of the forest to graze, their fawns tottering on spindly legs. Bears emerged from hibernation, hungry and irritable, requiring careful avoidance. Clara learned to identify the flowers and herbs that grew wild around the cabin. Some were useful: chamomile for tea, mint for settling upset stomachs, yarrow for treating wounds. Others were simply beautiful, and she picked bouquets to brighten the cabin, filling it with color and fragrance. "My mother used to do this," she told Harlan, arranging a vase of wildflowers on the table. "Every spring she'd fill our house with flowers. She said it brought life inside after the death of winter." "She sounds like a wise woman." She was. Clara touched a delicate blue petal, her expression wistful. "I wish you could have met her. I think she would have loved you." Harlan raised an eyebrow. "A hermit who talks to wolves?" Most mothers would be horrified. "Most mothers didn't know you," Clara smiled, "but mine would have seen what I see. A good man, a kind man, a man who deserves to be happy." He crossed the room and wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on top of her head. "I am happy," he murmured. "Happier than I ever thought I could be again." They stood like that for a long moment, watching the afternoon light slant through the windows, breathing in the scent of wildflowers and pine. And Clara thought, with a certainty that warmed her to her core, that this was exactly where she was meant to be. Not all the changes that came with spring were welcome, however. As the mountain passes cleared and travel became possible again, news began to trickle up from Copper Ridge. A trader passing through brought stories of the town below, gossip about who had married whom, which businesses had failed over the winter, what scandals had erupted in the long, dark months. And he brought news of Samuel Wynne. "Your father's in a bad way, miss," the trader told Clara, his weathered face sympathetic. "Lost everything he had in a card game about 2 months back. He's been living rough ever since, begging for drinks, sleeping in alleys. Some folks feel sorry for him, but most just want him gone." Clara listened to this report with a strange detachment. She'd expected to feel something, anger perhaps, or satisfaction, or even pity.
Instead, she felt only a hollow emptiness, as if the man the traitor described were a stranger rather than her own flesh and blood. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "Is there anything else?" The traitor hesitated, glancing at Harlan. "Well, miss, there's one more thing. That man Blackwood, the one from Helena? He's been asking around about you, offering money for information on where you went." Clara's blood ran cold. "Blackwood? He's been back to Copper Ridge twice since you disappeared. Says you owe him for breach of contract. Says he'll find you eventually, one way or another." After the traitor left, laden with furs and preserved meat in exchange for his supplies and information, Clara sat on the porch in silence, staring out at the mountains without really seeing them. Shadow pressed against her legs, whining softly, sensing her distress. Harlan found her there an hour later, still unmoving, still silent. "Clara." He sat down beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. "Talk to me." "He's looking for me." Her voice was flat, emotionless. "Blackwood. He hasn't forgotten. He won't stop." "Let him look." Harlan's tone was hard as stone. "He won't find you, and if he does what? You'll kill him?" Clara turned to face him, and there was fear in her eyes. Not of Harlan, but of what he might become for her sake. "I don't want that. I don't want you to become a murderer again because of me." "I did what I did for Eliza, and I'd do it again," Harlan said quietly. "For her, for you, for anyone who threatens my family. That's what I'm afraid of." Clara reached out and took his hands, her grip tight. "I've seen what revenge did to you, Harlan. The guilt you carry, the nightmares that won't leave you alone. I don't want to be the reason you add more weight to that burden." "You wouldn't be the reason. He would be. It doesn't matter whose fault it is. The blood would still be on your hands. The memories would still haunt you." She lifted one of his hands and pressed it to her cheek. "I love you. I love the man you're becoming, the man who reads poetry and carves birds and talks to wolves. I don't want to lose him to the darkness again." Harlan was silent for a long moment, his jaw tight, his eyes troubled. Then he sighed and gathered her into his arms, holding her close. "I won't go looking for trouble," he promised. "But if trouble comes here, I will protect you. That's not negotiable." Clara nodded against his chest, accepting the compromise. It wasn't perfect, but nothing ever was. All they could do was live each day as it came and hope that the shadows of the past would stay where they belonged. The summer months passed in a golden haze of work and love and growing contentment. Clara's nightmares, which had plagued her since childhood, began to fade. She slept soundly now, wrapped in quilts that smelled of lavender, knowing that Harlan was just beyond the door and Shadow was watching over them both. She grew stronger too. The physical labor of mountain life, chopping wood, hauling water, tending the garden they'd planted behind the cabin, transformed her body from the pale, fragile thing it had been into something lean and capable. Her hands developed calluses, her arms showed muscle. Her skin took on the healthy glow of someone who spent hours each day in the sun and wind. "You're beautiful," Harlan told her one evening, watching her hang laundry on the line they'd strung between two pine trees. "More beautiful than when I first saw you." Clara laughed. "When you first saw me, I was covered in blood and wearing a dress that was 3 sizes too big for me. You were still beautiful, scared and bloody and beautiful." He came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "But you're more beautiful now, because you're happy." "I am happy," she admitted, leaning back against him. "Happier than I've ever been." "Good." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "I want to keep you happy. Forever, if you'll let me." Clara's heart skipped a beat. "Forever is a long time." "Not long enough, not with you." She turned in his arms and looked up at him, searching his face. "Harlan Drake, are you asking me something?" "Not yet." His smile was small but genuine. "When I ask, you'll know, but I'm working up to it, trying to figure out how to do it right." "There's no wrong way," Clara said softly. "Not between us." "There is for me." His expression grew serious. "I asked Eliza in a field of wildflowers, at sunset, with a ring I'd saved 6 months to buy. It was perfect. Everything was perfect.
He paused, swallowing hard. I can't give you that. I can't give you a church wedding or a proper honeymoon or any of the things a woman deserves. But I want to give you something. Something that's just ours. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. You've already given me everything, she whispered. You gave me my freedom. You gave me a home. You gave me your heart. I want to give you my name too. His voice was rough with emotion. When I'm ready, when I can do it properly. She reached up and cupped his face in her hands. I'll wait, she said. However long it takes. I'll wait. They kissed then, soft and sweet, a promise sealed without words. And Clara knew with absolute certainty that she would never love anyone else the way she loved this wounded, gentle, impossible man. As summer reached its peak, Harlan began teaching Clara more advanced survival skills. She learned to fish in the cold mountain streams, to identify animal tracks and scat, to read the landscape for signs of weather change. She learned which plants were poisonous and which could save a life, which mushrooms were safe to eat and which would kill you within hours. Why are you teaching me all this? She asked one afternoon, after a particularly grueling lesson on setting snares. Harlan didn't answer immediately. He finished adjusting the snare, then sat back on his heels and looked at her with those gray eyes that seemed to see everything. Because the mountains are dangerous, he said finally. Because anything can happen. An accident, an illness, a winter storm that lasts longer than expected. If something happens to me, I need to know you can survive on your own. Clara's stomach clenched. Don't talk like that. I'm not being morbid. I'm being practical. He stood and brushed dirt from his knees. I'm 43 years old, Clara. You're 19. The odds are good that you'll outlive me by decades. I want those decades to be long and full, not cut short because you didn't know how to start a fire or find clean water. Stop it, Clara's voice cracked. Just stop. I don't want to think about life without you. Neither do I. He came to her and took her hands, his grip firm and warm. But part of loving someone is preparing for the worst while hoping for the best. I lost Eliza because I wasn't prepared. I wasn't there when she needed me. I won't make that mistake again. Clara looked at him for a long moment, seeing the fear beneath his practical words, the desperate love that drove him to plan for a future he couldn't control. And she understood finally that this was how Harlan Drake expressed his devotion, not through flowery words or grand gestures, but through careful preparation, through making sure the people he loved would be safe no matter what. Okay, she said quietly, teach me everything. I want to learn. He smiled, a real smile full of relief and pride. That's my girl. The lessons continued throughout the summer, and Clara absorbed them all like a sponge. By the time the first leaves began to turn, she could gut a fish, set a bone, build a shelter from pine branches, start a fire in the rain, navigate by the stars, and identify edible plants in any season. She wasn't an expert, not yet, but she was capable, competent, and confident in a way she'd never been before. She was, as Harlan had said that first day in the snow, becoming a proper mountain woman. Fall arrived with a blaze of color that took Clara's breath away. The aspens turned gold, the maples red, the oaks a deep burnished bronze. The mountains looked like they were on fire, and the air grew crisp and sweet with the smell of decaying leaves and ripening apples. It was during this golden time, as they worked together to harvest the garden and prepare for winter, that Clara first noticed something was different. She was tired. More tired than usual, despite the shorter days. Her stomach, usually reliable, had become unpredictable, rebelling at the smell of cooking meat. And her courses, always regular, had failed to appear for 2 months running. She didn't say anything to Harlan at first. She wasn't sure, couldn't be sure, and she didn't want to raise hopes or fears unnecessarily. But as the weeks passed and her symptoms continued, she could no longer deny what her body was telling her. She was carrying Harlan Drake's child. The realization hit her one morning as she stood at the window, watching the wolves play in the first frost of autumn. She pressed her hand to her still flat stomach and felt tears slide down her cheeks, tears of joy, of terror, of overwhelming love. A baby. Their baby. A new life growing inside her, a miracle she had never dared to hope for. But what would Harlan say? He had lost one child already, a daughter who had never drawn breath, who had died in the womb with her mother. Would this news bring him happiness, or would it only reopen old wounds? She decided to wait, to be absolutely certain, to find the right moment, the right words. But as it turned out, she didn't have to say anything at all. "Clara." Harlan's voice came from behind her, quiet and uncertain. "Is there something you need to tell me?" She turned to face him, her hand still pressed to her stomach. His eyes followed the movement, and she saw understanding dawn in their gray depths. "How did you know?" she whispered. "I was married before," he said simply. "I know the signs." He took a step closer, his expression unreadable. Are you?" "Yes." The word came out barely audible. "I'm sure now. About 3 months along, I think." For a moment that stretched into eternity, Harlan said nothing. He stood frozen, his face pale, his hands clenched at his sides. Clara watched him, her heart pounding, afraid of what she might see when the mask finally cracked. Then, slowly, he fell to his knees before her. "Harlan." He pressed his forehead to her stomach, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Clara's own tears flowed freely as she stroked his hair, holding him close, feeling the tremors that racked his massive frame. "A baby," he finally managed, his voice muffled against her dress. "Our baby." "Yes." She lifted his chin, forcing him to look at her. Is this okay? I know the memories must be." "Okay?" He laughed, a wet, broken sound. "Clara, this is everything. Everything I thought I'd lost forever." He rose to his feet and cupped her face in his hands, his gray eyes bright with tears. "I love you. I love you so much it terrifies me. And I will love this child with everything I have. I swear it." Clara threw her arms around him, burying her face in his chest. "I was so scared," she confessed. "I didn't know how you'd react. I didn't want to hurt you." "You could never hurt me." He held her tightly, fiercely. "You've healed me, Clara. You and this baby, you've healed me." They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, the autumn light streaming through the windows around them. Outside, the wolves began to howl, not the mournful sound of mourning, but something higher, sweeter, almost like singing. "They know," Harlan murmured against her hair. "Somehow, they know." Clara smiled through her tears. "Then I guess it's official. We're going to be a family." "We already are," Harlan said. "We already are." That evening, Harlan asked Clara to marry him. He didn't do it with a ring. There was no ring to give, not yet, but with words, simple and true, spoken by firelight, with Shadow watching from her customary spot on the porch. "I know it's not the proposal you deserve," he said, kneeling before her as he had done that morning. "I don't have flowers or music or any of the things a man should have when he asks the woman he loves to be his wife. But I have my heart, Clara, and it's yours. It's been yours since that night in the saloon, when you looked at me and didn't flinch away." Clara reached out and touched his face, feeling the roughness of his beard, the wetness of tears on his cheeks. "I have nothing to give you but myself," he continued, his voice breaking. "But I promise to love you until my last breath. I promise to protect you and our child with my life. I promise to be the man you see in me, even when I can't see him myself." He took her hand and pressed it to his chest, where his heart beat strong and steady. "Clara Wynne, will you be my wife?" She didn't hesitate. She didn't need to. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Harlan Drake 1,000 times, yes." He kissed her then, deep and passionate and full of promise. And outside, the wolves howled their approval to the stars. The winter that followed was different from the last. Clara was no longer a frightened stranger, huddling in borrowed clothes in a cabin she didn't understand. She was home, truly home, building a life with the man she loved, preparing for the child growing inside her. The storms still came, fierce and relentless, but they felt less threatening now. The cabin was a haven, not a prison. They were married in December on the winter solstice, the longest night of the year. There was no priest. The nearest one was 3 days' ride away, and Clara's condition made travel inadvisable. But Harlan had lived among the Blackfoot people for several years after Eliza's death, and he knew their ways.
The Blackfoot believed that marriage is a bond between souls, he explained, as they stood together in the snow beneath a canopy of stars. It doesn't require a witness except the earth and sky and the spirits that dwell in all living things. Clara shivered, but not from the cold. She was wrapped in furs Harlan had sewn himself, her cheeks pink from the winter air, her stomach beginning to round with their child. Shadow sat at her feet, watching with those knowing yellow eyes, and in the distance the rest of the pack had gathered to observe. "What do we do?" Clara asked. "We speak our vows, we bind ourselves together, and we trust that whatever powers exist in this world will honor what we've made." They held hands, facing each other in the moonlight. Around them the mountains stood silent and eternal, guardians of this sacred moment. "I take you as my wife," Harlan said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "I promise to love you, protect you, honor you, for all the days of my life. When the wolves howl, I will howl with them for you. When the snows come, I will be your warmth. When darkness falls, I will be your light. This I swear by the mountains that have been my refuge, by the wolves that are my family, by the spirits of those who came before us." Clara felt tears freezing on her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away. "I take you as my husband," she said, her voice trembling with love. "I promise to love you, stand beside you, build a life with you for all the days of my life. When you forget your worth, I will remind you. When you carry burdens alone, I will help you bear them. When the past comes calling, I will face it with you. This I swear by the stars that guided me to you, by the child that grows within me, by the love that saved us both." Harlan reached into his coat and produced something small, something that glinted in the moonlight. Clara gasped. It was a ring, carved from bone and inlaid with a tiny piece of turquoise, polished until it gleamed like the summer sky. "I made it," he said, his voice gruff with embarrassment. "It's not gold, but it's perfect." Clara extended her hand, and he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit as if it had been made for her, which, of course, it had. "With this ring, I wed thee," Harlan said. "Now and forever." "Now and forever," Clara echoed. And then the wolves began to howl. Not one or two, but all of them, their voices rising in a wild, beautiful chorus that seemed to fill the entire valley. Clara laughed through her tears, and Harlan pulled her close, and they kissed under the stars while the mountains and wolves bore witness to their union. It wasn't a traditional wedding. There was no church, no congregation, no white dress or wedding feast. But as Clara stood in her husband's arms, feeling the ring on her finger and the baby stirring in her womb, she knew it was perfect. Absolutely, utterly perfect. The months that followed were quiet and full. Clara's pregnancy progressed smoothly, and Harlan hovered around her with a mixture of awe and anxiety that she found simultaneously endearing and exasperating. "I'm pregnant, not dying," she told him one afternoon, after he'd insisted she rest instead of helping with the cooking. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time." "I know." His jaw was tight. "But women have also died having babies since the beginning of time." Clara's irritation softened. She reached out and took his hand. "I'm healthy, Harlan. Strong. This baby is strong. We're going to be fine." "You can't know that." His voice cracked. "No one can know that." She understood then the fear that drove him. He had lost everything once before: wife, child, hope. The prospect of losing it all again was more than he could bear. "Come here," she said, pulling him down to sit beside her. She took his hand and pressed it to her swollen belly, where the baby was kicking with increasing vigor. "Feel that? That's our daughter. Yes, I think it's a girl too, and she's fighting to be born. She's going to make it, Harlan. We all are." He closed his eyes, his hand trembling against her stomach. "How can you be so sure?" "Because I have to be." She kissed his forehead. "Because hope is all we have, and because I refuse to let fear steal the joy of this moment." Harlan was quiet for a long moment. Then he let out a shaky breath and nodded. "You're right. You're always right. Remember that when we argue about names?" That surprised a laugh out of him. "We're arguing about names?" "We will be. I have opinions." "I'm sure you do." He pulled her close, careful of her belly, and pressed his lips to her hair. "I love you, Clara Drake." She smiled against his chest. I love you too, Harlan. And so does our daughter, whoever she turns out to be. But even as she spoke the words of comfort, Clara couldn't quite shake her own fears. Childbirth was dangerous, especially here, miles from any doctor or midwife. If something went wrong, she pushed the thought away. Hope, she reminded herself. Hope was all they had. As winter slowly released its grip and the first signs of spring appeared in the valley, Clara and Harlan prepared for the arrival of their child. Harlan built a cradle from pine wood, carved with the same delicate attention he gave to his figurines. Clara sewed tiny clothes from soft fabric, her stitches neat and careful. And they talked about the future. I want her to be educated, Clara said one evening, as they sat together watching the fire, to know how to read and write and think for herself. My mother always said that education was the greatest gift a parent could give. We have books, Harlan offered. Plenty of them. And you can teach her, like Mrs. Hennessy taught me. Clara nodded, liking the idea. I want her to know music too, and poetry, and how to survive in the wilderness like you've taught me. She'll know it all. Harlan stroked her hair, his touch gentle. She'll be the most educated, most capable, most loved child in the Montana Territory. She'll be wild, Clara said with a smile, running with wolves, climbing mountains, driving us both to distraction. Good. Harlan's voice was full of warmth. She should be wild. She should be free. She should have everything we never had. Clara turned to look at him, her heart full to bursting. I love you, she said simply. I don't say it enough. You don't have to say it. He kissed her softly. I see it in everything you do. They sat together in comfortable silence after that, watching the flames dance, listening to the distant howl of wolves. And Clara let herself believe, truly believe, that everything would be all right. The baby came in late April as the last snows melted and the first wildflowers pushed through the earth. Clara had been having pains all day, but she hadn't said anything, not wanting to alarm Harlan unnecessarily. It was only when her water broke, soaking the floor of the cabin, that she finally admitted the truth. It's time, she gasped, gripping the back of a chair as a contraction tore through her. Harlan went pale. Now? But it's too early. Babies come when they're ready. Clara forced herself to breathe through the pain. Help me to the bed and boil water, lots of water. The hours that followed were the longest of Clara's life. The contractions came in waves, each one more intense than the last, and between them she drifted in a haze of exhaustion and fear. Harlan stayed by her side throughout, holding her hand, wiping the sweat from her brow, murmuring words of encouragement that she could barely hear. You're doing so well, he said, his voice strained. You're so strong, Clara. Just a little longer. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him he had no idea what he was talking about, but she didn't have the energy for anger. All she had was the relentless push of the baby inside her, demanding to be born. It was nearly midnight when the final contraction hit, a tearing, burning sensation that made Clara cry out in agony. She pushed with everything she had, felt something give way, and then a cry. Thin and wavering at first, then stronger, louder, filling the cabin with the sound of new life. It's a girl. Harlan's voice was choked with tears. Clara, it's a girl. She's perfect. Clara reached for her daughter, her arms trembling with exhaustion. Harlan placed the baby on her chest, still wet and red and screaming, the most beautiful thing Clara had ever seen. Hello, little one, she whispered. We've been waiting for you. The baby quieted at the sound of her mother's voice, her tiny eyes blinking open to reveal irises as gray as a winter storm. She has your eyes, Clara said, looking up at Harlan. He was crying openly now, tears streaming down his weathered face. She's a miracle, he managed. You both are. Outside, as if on cue, the wolves began to howl. Not their usual mournful cry, but something softer, sweeter, a lullaby for the child who had just entered their world. Loretta, Clara murmured, remembering the name Harlan had mentioned all those months ago. Is that what you want to call her? Harlan was quiet for a long moment. Then he shook his head. That was Eliza's choice. For the daughter, we lost. He reached out and touched the baby's cheek, his finger gentle as a whisper. This is a new life, a new beginning. She deserves her own name. What do you suggest? He thought about it, watching the baby nestle against her mother's chest. Hope, he said finally. I want to call her Hope. Clara smiled, her eyes filling with tears. Hope Drake? It's perfect. She is perfect. Harlan leaned down and kissed first the baby's head, then Clara's lips. You both are. My girls. My family. My heart. And in that moment, with her daughter in her arms and her husband by her side, Clara knew that every trial she had endured, every loss, every fear, every dark moment had led her here. To this cabin in the mountains, to this man who had saved her, to this child who represented everything good and beautiful in the world. She was home. At last, she was home. The weeks following Hope's birth were a blur of sleepless nights, endless feedings, and a bone-deep exhaustion that Clara had never experienced before. But woven through the tiredness was a joy so profound it brought tears to her eyes at unexpected moments, when Hope's tiny fingers wrapped around her own, when those storm-gray eyes focused on her face with something like recognition, when Harlan sang lullabies in his rough, untrained voice, and their daughter fell asleep against his massive chest. They had become a family in truth now, not just in name. The cabin that had once seemed like a refuge felt like a home, filled with the sounds of a baby's cries and laughter, with the smell of milk and lavender and the ever-present pine smoke from the fire. Shadow had taken to sleeping inside now, curled at the foot of Clara's bed, her yellow eyes watching over the cradle with fierce devotion. She thinks the baby is her pup, Harlan observed one morning, watching Shadow nuzzle Hope's tiny hand. Clara smiled, though exhaustion made even that simple gesture feel like effort. Is that a problem? Not at all. Wolf mothers are the most protective creatures on Earth. Our daughter couldn't ask for a better guardian. Our daughter. The words still sent a thrill through Clara's heart, even after weeks of hearing them. Our daughter, our family, our life. Spring deepened into early summer, and Hope grew with astonishing speed. She was a good baby, calm, curious, rarely fussy except when hungry or tired. She had Harlan's gray eyes and Clara's honey-brown hair, and already she showed signs of her father's quiet intensity, staring at the world around her with a focused attention that seemed far beyond her weeks. She's watching the wolves, Clara said one afternoon, as they sat on the porch watching the pack play in the meadow below. Hope was cradled in her arms, her eyes tracking the silver shapes as they chased each other through the wildflowers. She's one of them, Harlan said quietly. They know it. She knows it. It should have seemed strange, raising a child among wolves, but to Clara, who had found her own salvation in this wild place, it felt perfectly natural. Hope would grow up knowing the forest as intimately as she knew her own home. She would learn the language of wind and water, of bird and beast, of mountain and sky. She would be wild and free and unafraid. She would have everything Clara had never had. The peace of those early weeks was so complete, so all-encompassing, that Clara almost forgot about the shadows that waited beyond the mountains. Almost forgot about Blackwood and his threats, about her father and his debts, about the world that existed beyond the boundaries of their valley. But the world had not forgotten about her. It was a morning in late June when the first sign of trouble appeared. Harlan had gone to check his trap lines, leaving Clara alone with Hope and Shadow. She was hanging laundry on the line, tiny clothes that seemed impossibly small, each one a reminder of the miracle sleeping in the cradle inside, when Shadow's ears pricked up and a low growl rumbled in her throat. Clara stopped, her hands full of wet cloth, her heart suddenly pounding. "What is it, girl?" Shadow was staring down the mountain toward the trail that led to Copper Ridge. Her growl intensified, her hackles rising, her body tense with warning. Someone was coming. Clara dropped the laundry and ran inside, scooping Hope from her cradle and pressing the baby close to her chest. Her mind raced through possibilities. A trader, perhaps? They came occasionally, bringing news and supplies from the valley below. A lost traveler seeking directions. Maybe even someone from the Blackfoot settlement to the north, whom Harlan had mentioned as friends. But Shadow's reaction suggested otherwise. The wolf knew the difference between friend and threat, and right now, every line of her body screamed danger. Clara grabbed Harlan's hunting rifle from its place above the mantel. She'd never fired it, but Harlan had taught her how to load it. how to aim, how to squeeze the trigger rather than pull. She positioned herself by the window, Hope clutched against her shoulder, the rifle balanced awkwardly in her free hand. And she waited. The riders appeared 20 minutes later, 3 of them, picking their way up the narrow trail on horseback. They were well armed, well dressed, clearly not traders or travelers. Something about the lead rider made Clara's blood run cold, though at this distance she couldn't make out his features. Then they drew closer, and she recognized him, Caleb Rourke. The name surfaced from the murky depths of her memory, bringing with it a wave of revulsion and fear. Caleb Rourke, son of the wealthiest rancher in the Montana Territory. Caleb Rourke, who had pursued Clara with unwanted attention for months before her father's debts forced them to flee Billings. Caleb Rourke, whose proposal she had rejected so firmly that he'd sworn she would regret it someday. That day, it seemed, had finally come. "Clara Wynne!" His voice carried up the mountain, confident and commanding. "I know you're in there. Come out and let's talk like civilized people." Clara didn't move. She barely breathed. In her arms, Hope began to stir, disturbed by her mother's tension. "Shh, little one," Clara whispered. "Shh, Mama's here. Everything's going to be fine." But even as she said the words, she knew they might be lies. The riders had stopped at the edge of the clearing, just out of rifle range. Clara could see them more clearly now. Caleb in his expensive clothes, his handsome face twisted with an expression that might have been triumph or anger or both. 2 rough-looking men she didn't recognize, mercenaries by the look of them, hired muscle for whatever Caleb had planned. "I'm not leaving until I speak with you," Caleb called again. "Your father told me everything. How that monster Drake bought you like cattle, how he's kept you prisoner up here in the wilderness. I've come to rescue you, Clara. To take you home where you belong." Rescue. The word tasted bitter in Clara's mouth. She thought of Blackwood, of Helena, of the fate that had awaited her before Harlan intervened. That was what awaited her if she left with Caleb. Not rescue, but another kind of prison. "I don't need rescuing," she shouted through the window, keeping her body hidden, the rifle ready. "Go back to wherever you came from, Caleb. I'm exactly where I want to be." A pause, then laughter, cold and cruel. "Do you hear that, boys? The little witch thinks she wants to be here, living like an animal with that murderer and his wolves." Caleb's voice hardened. "Your father signed a contract, Clara. A marriage contract. You were promised to me before Drake interfered. I'm here to collect what's mine." Clara's stomach turned. A contract. Of course. Her father must have been even more desperate than she'd realized, selling her to the highest bidder like livestock at auction. First Blackwood, now Caleb. How many times had Samuel Wynne traded his daughter's future for the price of a drink? "Any contract my father signed is void," she called back. "I'm married now, Caleb, legally wed, with witnesses and vows. You have no claim on me." "Married?" Caleb laughed again. "To that beast? That's no marriage. That's captivity. And when I bring you before a proper judge, he'll see it the same way. He'll annul whatever farce you've committed and recognize my prior claim." His voice dropped, became something oily and threatening. "This can be easy or hard, Clara. Come out now, and I'll treat you gently. Make me come in after you, and I won't be so kind." Shadow's growl had become a continuous rumble, and Clara saw movement at the edge of the forest. The rest of the pack, drawn by the tension, watching from the shadows of the trees. They were waiting, she realized. Waiting for a signal, a command, permission to defend their territory. She thought about giving it. She thought about letting the wolves loose on these men who threatened her family. But something held her back. The knowledge that violence would only bring more violence, that Caleb's death would bring his father's wrath down on them, that there had to be another way. "Leave now," she said, her voice steady despite her pounding heart. "My husband will return soon, and he won't be as polite as I am. If you're still here when he arrives, he'll kill you." "Your husband?" Caleb sneered. "You mean the mountain hermit who speaks to wolves and murders men?" "Yes, I've heard the stories. I've also heard he's getting old, getting slow. 3 against 1, with guns against knives. I like those odds." Clara's finger tightened on the trigger. 3 against 1? You're forgetting about me, and the wolves, and the fact that Harlan Drake has survived worse than you can possibly imagine. Turn around, Caleb. Go home. This is my only warning. For a long moment, nothing happened. Claire could see Caleb conferring with his hired men, their voices too low to hear. Then he turned back toward the cabin, and his smile was the coldest thing she'd ever seen. "We'll be back," he called, "with more men, with the sheriff, with everyone who needs to hear how Harlan Drake kidnapped an innocent woman and forced her into depravity. You may have fooled yourself into thinking this is love, Clara, but I know the truth, and soon everyone will know it." He wheeled his horse around and galloped down the mountain, his men following close behind. Clara watched until they disappeared around a bend in the trail, then lowered the rifle with trembling hands. Hope was crying now, upset by the tension and the shouting. Clara soothed her automatically, her mind racing through possibilities, none of them good. Caleb would return, she had no doubt of that. He would bring reinforcements, just as he'd promised. And when he did, she didn't want to think about when he did. Harlan returned an hour later, his saddlebags full of game, his expression immediately shifting from contentment to alarm when he saw Clara's face. "What happened?" he demanded, swinging down from his horse. "Are you hurt? Is Hope—" "We're fine." Clara met him at the door, Hope still in her arms, and told him everything. Caleb's arrival, his threats, the contract her father had signed. She watched Harlan's face change as she spoke, watched the gentle man she loved disappear behind a mask of cold fury. "Rourke," he said finally, the name like a curse. "I know that family. The father owns half the territory and the son thinks he owns the rest. They're used to getting what they want." "He wants me." Clara's voice cracked. "He'll come back, Harlan, with more men, with the law on his side, or what passes for law out here." Harlan was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working, his hands clenched at his sides. When he spoke, his voice was low and dangerous. "Then we need to be ready." The days that followed were tense, watchful, filled with preparation and dread. Harlan fortified the cabin as best he could, reinforcing the door, creating sight lines for defensive fire, establishing escape routes through the forest in case the worst happened. He taught Clara to shoot properly, not just the basics, but the fine points of aim and timing that could mean the difference between life and death. "I don't want to kill anyone," she said, after successfully hitting 3 targets in a row. "Neither do I." Harlan's expression was grim. "But sometimes the choice isn't ours to make." They talked about leaving, abandoning the cabin, fleeing deeper into the mountains, starting over somewhere Caleb and his men would never find them. But Clara rejected the idea almost before Harlan finished proposing it. "This is our home," she said fiercely. "You built it for Eliza, and now it's ours. I won't let Caleb Rourke drive us from the only place we've ever been happy." "Your life is more important than any building," Harlan argued. "Hope's life. Our lives mean nothing if we spend them running." Clara took his hands, her grip tight. "I ran for years, Harlan, from town to town, always looking over my shoulder, always waiting for the next disaster. I won't do it anymore, not now that I finally have something worth fighting for." He stared at her for a long moment, and she saw the war playing out behind his eyes, the instinct to protect at any cost warring with respect for her choice. Finally, he nodded. "Then we fight. Together." "Together," Clara agreed. "Always." A week passed, then 2. The summer heat settled over the valley like a blanket, and still Caleb didn't return. Clara began to hope, against her better judgment, that perhaps he'd given up. Perhaps he'd realized she wasn't worth the trouble. Perhaps his father had talked sense into him. But Harlan knew better. "He's gathering support," he said grimly, "building a case. When he comes back, it won't be with 3 men. It'll be with an army." He was right. They came on a Sunday morning in early August, just as the sun was cresting the eastern peaks. Clara was feeding hope when Shadow began to howl. Not a warning growl this time, but a full-throated cry of alarm that brought the rest of the pack running from wherever they'd been scattered. Harlan was at the window before Clara could even rise. What she saw in his face made her blood turn to ice. "How many?" she whispered. 15, maybe 20, armed, some in uniform." His voice was flat, emotionless, the voice of a man preparing for war. "They've brought the sheriff." Clara joined him at the window, hope pressed close to her chest, and looked down at the army approaching their home. Caleb rode at the front, of course, his handsome face alight with triumph. Behind him came a motley collection of men, hired guns, townspeople, even a few she recognized from her brief time in Copper Ridge. And riding beside Caleb, his badge glinting in the morning light, was Sheriff Thomas Grady. Grady was a hard man, she'd heard, fair, mostly, but with a rigid view of law and order that left little room for nuance. If Caleb had convinced him that Clara was being held against her will, that Harlan was the monster everyone believed him to be. "Harlan Drake!" Grady's voice boomed across the clearing. "By the authority vested in me by the territory of Montana, I order you to release Clara Wynne and surrender yourself for questioning." Harlan didn't respond. He was checking his rifle, counting ammunition, moving with the calm efficiency of a man who had faced death before. "Harlan," Clara grabbed his arm, "you can't fight them. There are too many." "I can slow them down. Give you time to escape with hope." "No." The word came out fierce, desperate. "I won't leave you. We fight together, remember?" "Clara," I said no. She was crying now, tears streaming down her face, but her voice was steady. "If you go out there, they'll kill you. And then they'll take me anyway, and Hope will grow up without a father. Is that what you want?" Harlan's resolve wavered. She could see it. The thought of Hope, of their daughter, was the one thing that could break through his warrior's determination. "What would you have me do?" he asked quietly. "Surrender? Let them take you?" "Let me talk to them." Clara wiped her tears with the back of her hand. "Let me explain. I'll show them hope. Let them see that I'm not a prisoner. Maybe the sheriff will listen to reason." "And if he doesn't?" Clara looked at the army gathered below, at Caleb's triumphant smile, at the guns and torches and righteous fury of men who believed they were saving a woman from a monster. "Then we fight," she said, "but not until we've exhausted every other option." Harlan was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "I'll be right behind you. If anything goes wrong, I know." She kissed him, hard and fast, pouring all her love and fear into that single moment of contact. "I love you, Harlan Drake." "I love you too, Clara. More than life itself." She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and walked out to face the mob. The clearing fell silent as Clara emerged from the cabin. She moved slowly, carefully, hope cradled against her chest, her chin high despite the terror churning in her gut. She could feel the eyes of 20 men on her, assessing, judging, deciding whether she was victim or willing participant in whatever crimes they believed had been committed. Sheriff Grady dismounted and approached her, his weathered face unreadable. "Mrs. Wynne?" "Mrs. Drake," Clara corrected quietly. "I'm married now, Sheriff." A murmur ran through the crowd, and Caleb pushed forward, his expression darkening. "She's lying, or deluded. That savage has brainwashed her, twisted her mind." "Let the lady speak, Mr. Rourke." Grady's voice was firm, brooking no argument. He turned back to Clara, his eyes dropping to the baby in her arms. "Is that child yours?" "Yes, mine and Harlan's. Her name is Hope." Another murmur, louder this time. Clara saw some of the men exchanging glances, uncertainty replacing conviction. A baby changed things. A baby made this more complicated than a simple rescue mission. "Mr. Rourke claims you were purchased against your will," Grady said. "That you've been held captive in this cabin for over a year. That the man inside is a known murderer who has kept you isolated from all contact with the outside world." "Mr. Rourke is wrong." Clara's voice rang out clear and strong. "My father sold me to a man named Blackwood, who intended to force me into prostitution in Helena. Harlan Drake paid $800 in gold to save me from that fate. He brought me here, gave me shelter, gave me a choice. I chose to stay. I chose to marry him. I chose to have his child. Every decision has been mine, Sheriff. Every single one." Caleb's face twisted with rage. "She's lying, or she doesn't know what she's saying. Stockholm Syndrome, gentlemen. That's what this is. The victim identifies with her captor, defends him, even claims to love him." "I'm not a victim." Clara's voice rose, sharp with anger. "I'm a woman who was given no choices my entire life, until one man offered me the freedom to choose for myself. You want to talk about captivity, Caleb? Let's talk about the marriage contract my father signed without my knowledge or consent. Let's talk about how you plan to treat me like property, just like Blackwood did. The only difference between you is the price you are willing to pay." Silence fell over the clearing. Clara could see doubt creeping into the faces of the men who had come to rescue her. Doubt about Caleb's story, doubt about their mission, doubt about who the real villain was in this tale. "Sheriff Grady."
Clara met his eyes, willing him to see the truth. "I am not a captive. I am not brainwashed. I am a woman who found love in an unexpected place with an unexpected man. Harlan Drake saved my life. He has never raised a hand to me, never forced me to do anything against my will, never been anything but gentle and kind. If that makes him a monster, then I pray for more monsters in this world." Grady was quiet for a long moment, studying her face, her posture, the way she held her child. Clara knew he was looking for signs of abuse, of coercion, of the fear that would mark a true captive. She held his gaze steadily, letting him see exactly who and what she was. "She's a liar!" Caleb's voice cracked with frustration. "Can't you see she's protecting him? He's threatened her, threatened the baby." "That's enough, Mr. Rourke." Grady's voice was cold. "The woman seems lucid and unharmed. The child appears healthy and well cared for."
"Unless you have evidence of an actual crime, I have a contract." Caleb pulled a crumpled paper from his coat. "Signed by her father, witnessed and sealed. She was promised to me before Drake interfered." Grady took the paper and examined it, his expression unreadable. Clara's heart sank. Whatever that contract said, it might be enough to justify taking her by force. "This contract is dated after Mrs. Drake's marriage," Grady said finally. "Even if it were legitimate, which I'm not convinced it is, it was signed after she was legally wed to another man. It's worthless." "My father had no right to sign it," Clara added. "I was already married, already carrying my husband's child. Any agreement he made was fraudulent from the start." Caleb's face had gone purple with rage. "You can't let her stay with that murderer. Everyone knows what he did. The men he killed were the outlaws who murdered his first wife and unborn child," Grady interrupted. "I've done my research, Mr. Rourke. Harlan Drake took justice into his own hands, yes. But the men he killed were wanted criminals with bounties on their heads. Some might call him a vigilante. Others might call him a grieving husband who punished those responsible for his loss." He folded the worthless contract and tucked it into his pocket. "Either way, it's not a matter for this posse." A ripple of unease ran through the gathered men. Clara could see them reconsidering, reevaluating, realizing that perhaps they'd been sold a different story than the one playing out before them. "Sheriff?" Caleb's voice had gone silky, dangerous. "Surely you're not going to let this stand. The woman is clearly compromised. She needs to be examined by a doctor, questioned by proper authorities. The woman is standing right here," Clara snapped, "and she doesn't need to be examined or questioned. She needs to be left in peace with her family." "Your family?" Caleb laughed, but there was an edge of hysteria to it. "Your family is a murderer and a pack of wild animals. You're raising that baby like a savage, and you expect us to just walk away?" "Yes." Clara's voice was ice. "That's exactly what I expect." Caleb stared at her for a long moment, and Clara saw something shift in his eyes, the realization that he was losing, that his rescue mission had become something else entirely, that the woman he'd come to claim was not the frightened girl he remembered. And then, without warning, he drew his pistol. "If I can't have you," he snarled, "then neither can he." Time seemed to slow. Clara saw the gun rise, saw Caleb's finger tighten on the trigger, saw death approaching with horrible inevitability. She had just enough time to think of hope, of Harlan, of the life they'd built together. And then the wolves attacked. They came from everywhere at once, gray shapes erupting from the forest, teeth flashing, snarls filling the air. The clearing exploded into chaos as horses reared and men screamed and gunshots echoed off the mountains. Clara dropped to her knees, shielding hope with her body, as the world dissolved into violence around her. She saw Gray, the alpha male, launch himself at Caleb, knocking the gun from his hand and bearing him to the ground. She saw Shadow standing over her, teeth bared, daring anyone to approach. She saw men fleeing in all directions, their courage shattered by the primal terror of a wolf pack on the attack. And then she saw Harlan. He emerged from the cabin like a force of nature, his rifle in his hands, his face set in lines of cold fury. He moved through the chaos with terrible efficiency, disarming men who had dropped their weapons, pulling horses away from fallen riders, calling commands to the wolves in a language Clara didn't understand. In minutes, it was over. The clearing was littered with dropped weapons, trampled supplies, abandoned horses. The posse had fled, scattered across the mountainside in their panic. Sheriff Grady stood alone near the edge of the forest, his own gun holstered, his face pale but composed. Caleb Rourke lay pinned beneath Gray's massive paws, whimpering with terror, his expensive clothes torn and bloodied from a dozen shallow bites. "Call it off," he begged, his voice high and thin. "Please call it off." Harlan approached slowly, his rifle trained on Caleb's forehead. "Give me one reason I shouldn't let him finish what he started." "Because you're better than him." Claire's voice rang out, steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. She rose to her feet, hope still clutched to her chest, and walked to stand beside her husband. "Because our daughter is watching. Because if you kill him in cold blood, you become what they say you are." Harlan didn't look at her, but she saw his jaw tighten, saw the struggle playing out behind his gray eyes. The wolves waited, silent and patient, ready to tear Caleb apart on command. "He tried to kill you," Harlan said quietly. "And he failed. Let the law handle him." Clara turned to Sheriff Grady, who was watching the scene with an expression of barely contained shock. "Sheriff, you witnessed what happened. Caleb Rourke drew his weapon on an unarmed woman holding an infant. That's attempted murder." Grady nodded slowly. "I saw it. A dozen of my men saw it too." "Then arrest him. Take him back to town. Let justice be served properly, through the courts, not through bloodshed." For a long, terrible moment, nothing happened. Harlan's finger rested on the trigger, his aim steady, his face unreadable. The wolf growled, its breath hot against Caleb's face. Then, slowly, Harlan lowered the rifle. "Gray," he said quietly, "release." The alpha wolf stepped back, and Caleb scrambled to his feet, his face a mask of terror and fury. "This isn't over," he spat. "My father will hear about this. He'll destroy you, Drake. He'll burn this cabin to the ground, and—" "Mr. Rourke," Grady's voice cut through the threats like a knife. "You are under arrest for attempted murder. You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you exercise it." Clara watched as the sheriff handcuffed Caleb and led him toward the remaining horses. She watched as the last of the posse members slunk out of the forest, shamefaced and frightened. She watched as the wolves formed a protective ring around the cabin, their yellow eyes gleaming with something that might have been satisfaction. And then, when it was finally over, she collapsed against Harlan and wept. He held her for a long time, one arm around her shoulders, one hand cradling Hope's head, his body a solid wall of warmth and safety. The wolves settled around them, Gray and Moon, Shadow and the others, a family united in the aftermath of violence. "It's over," Harlan murmured into her hair. "It's over, Clara. You're safe." "I was so scared," she confessed, her voice muffled against his chest. "When he pointed that gun, I thought, I know." His arms tightened around her. "I thought so too. When I heard the shot, He broke off, unable to continue. Clara looked up at him, seeing the fear behind his stoic mask, the love that had driven him to face an army for her sake. "You came for me. You always come for me." "Always," he agreed. "Until my last breath." They stood together as the sun rose higher, as the shadows of violence receded, as peace settled once more over their mountain home. Hope had fallen asleep against Clara's breast, untroubled by the chaos she was too young to understand. The wolves began to disperse, returning to their usual activities, the crisis over and forgotten. But Clara knew it wasn't truly over. Caleb's arrest would bring consequences, his father's wealth and influence, the inevitable retaliation of a powerful man whose heir had been humiliated. There would be more battles to fight, more threats to face, more moments when their little family's survival hung in the balance. But for now, in this moment, they had won. "We should go inside," she said finally. "Hope needs to eat, and I need to sit down." Harlan nodded, guiding her toward the cabin with gentle hands. At the door, he paused and looked back at the clearing, at the trampled ground, the scattered debris, the evidence of the confrontation that had just occurred. They'll be back, he said quietly. Maybe not Caleb, but others. Men who believe what he believes. Men who think they can take what isn't theirs. I know. Clara leaned against him, drawing strength from his presence. But we'll be ready. We'll always be ready. Together? She smiled despite everything. Together, always. They went inside, and the door closed behind them, shutting out the world and its dangers. The wolves took up their positions around the cabin. Silent sentinels, guardians of the family they had claimed as their own. And in the mountains of Montana, peace reigned once more. But Clara knew it wouldn't last. She could feel it in her bones, in the prickling of her skin, in the way Shadow's ears stayed pricked toward the trail that led down to the valley. The world wasn't done with them yet. The past had a way of refusing to stay buried, and the future held shadows they couldn't yet see. She nursed hope in the rocking chair Harlan had carved during the long winter nights, watching through the window as her husband moved around the clearing, gathering dropped weapons, calming the horses the posse had abandoned in their flight. He moved with the easy grace of a man completely at home in his environment, and she loved him so fiercely it felt like a physical ache. He had killed for her, or rather, he had been willing to kill for her, had stood at the precipice of violence and stepped back only because she'd asked him to. That kind of love was terrifying in its intensity, and Clara sometimes wondered if she deserved it. But then hope would stir in her arms, those gray eyes opening to find her mother's face, and Clara would know that she did. They all deserved this love, this family, this life they'd built against all odds, and she would fight to protect it just as fiercely as Harlan would, just as fiercely as the wolves who circled their home like silent prayers. The afternoon passed quietly. Harlan inventoried the supplies the posse had left behind, several rifles, boxes of ammunition, blankets, food stores. It was a small fortune in materials, and Clara could see him calculating how long it would last, what they could use, what they might need in the months to come. We should move, he said finally, as the sun began to sink toward the western peaks. Not far, just deeper into the mountains where it's harder to find us. Clara shook her head. We talked about this. I won't run. This isn't running. It's being strategic. Caleb's father will come for revenge, and when he does, we'll face him, just like we faced Caleb, just like we faced everything else. She rose from the rocking chair and crossed to where he stood by the window. Harlan, look at me! He turned, his gray eyes troubled, his jaw set in stubborn lines. This cabin is our home. It's where we were married, where hope was born, where we built our life together. If we abandon it every time someone threatens us, we'll be running forever. Is that what you want for our daughter? A life of constant flight, never knowing when we'll have to leave everything behind? I want her to be safe, Harlan said quietly. That's all I want. For both of you to be safe. We can be safe here. We proved that today. The wolves, the mountains, the knowledge you've given me, they're our protection. They're better than any fortress you could build. She took his hands, feeling the calluses and scars that told the story of his life. Trust in what we've created, Harlan. Trust in us. He was silent for a long moment, and she could see the war playing out behind his eyes. Finally, he sighed and pulled her close. You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met, he murmured against her hair. I learned from the best. Eliza wasn't stubborn. She was fierce. There's a difference. Clara smiled against his chest. Then maybe I learned from both of you. They held each other as the sun set, painting the mountains in shades of gold and pink and purple. Outside, the wolves began their evening song, a chorus of howls that seemed to carry all the beauty and wildness of the world within it. And Clara let herself believe once more that everything would be all right. The days that followed were tense but uneventful. No riders appeared on the trail. No threats emerged from the valley below. The world seemed to have forgotten about them, at least for the moment, and Clara clung to that peace with desperate gratitude. She returned to the rhythms of mountain life, tending the garden, preserving food for winter, caring for hope, loving Harlan in the quiet moments between tasks. She taught herself to read the weather better, to predict storms before they arrived, to know when the wolves were sensing something humans couldn't perceive. And she watched the trail. Always, She watched the trail. "You're going to wear a hole in the floor," Harlan observed one morning, finding her at her usual post by the window. "I can't help it." She didn't turn around. "Every time I close my eyes, I see Caleb pointing that gun. I see what could have happened." "What didn't happen?" Harlan came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "You're safe, Clara. Hope is safe. I won't let anything change that." "You can't promise that. Nobody can promise that." "No." His voice was quiet, honest. "But I can promise to fight for it. Every day, with everything I have. Isn't that enough?" Clara turned in his arms and looked up at him, at the face she loved, scarred and weathered and impossibly dear. "It's more than enough," she said. "It's everything." She kissed him then, soft and slow, trying to communicate everything she couldn't put into words. The fear and the love, the gratitude and the determination, the absolute certainty that she would rather die than live without him. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Harlan's eyes were bright with emotion. "Come with me," he said. "There's something I want to show you." He led her out of the cabin, past the garden and the woodpile, into the forest that bordered their little valley. Clara followed, curious despite herself, trusting him as she always did to lead her somewhere worth going. They walked for nearly an hour, following trails she'd never noticed before, climbing higher and higher into the mountains. The wolves accompanied them, Shadow at Clara's heel, the others ranging ahead, a protective escort through the wilderness. And then, suddenly, they emerged from the trees, and Clara gasped. They stood on a rocky outcrop overlooking a vista so beautiful it stole her breath. Mountains stretched in every direction, their peaks lost in clouds, their slopes carpeted with wildflowers and evergreens. A waterfall plunged from a cliff nearby, its spray creating rainbows in the morning light. Eagles soared overhead, and somewhere in the distance a bull elk bugled his challenge to the world. "This is where I scattered Eliza's ashes," Harlan said quietly. "I used to come here every day in those first years, to talk to her, to remember." Clara didn't know what to say. She reached for his hand and held it tight. "I haven't been back since you came into my life." He turned to look at her, and she saw tears on his weathered cheeks. "Not because I forgot her. I could never forget her, but because I found something I didn't think I'd ever find again. A reason to look forward instead of back. Harlan, I love you, Clara. I love hope. I love the life we've built together." He brought her hand to his lips and kissed it. "I brought you here because I wanted you to know. I wanted you to understand that you're not a replacement. You're not a substitute for what I lost. You're something new, something precious, something that belongs entirely to you." Clara was crying now, tears streaming down her face, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "I understand," she managed. "I've always understood." "I know." He smiled, that rare, beautiful smile that transformed his entire face. "That's why I love you." They stood together on that rocky outcrop, looking out at the world spread before them, and Clara felt something shift inside her. The fear that had dogged her since Caleb's attack, the constant vigilance, the waiting for the next disaster. It didn't disappear entirely, but it eased, loosened, became something she could carry without being crushed by its weight. This was her home. These mountains, this man, this life, and she would fight for it with everything she had. "Thank you for showing me this," she said finally. "Thank you for being here to see it." They made their way back to the cabin as the sun climbed higher, walking hand in hand through the forest, the wolves padding silently around them. Hope was waiting, fussing in her cradle, hungry and demanding attention, and Clara returned to the rhythms of motherhood with a lighter heart than she'd had in weeks. The world outside might be dangerous, unpredictable, full of men like Caleb Rourke who thought they could take whatever they wanted. But here, in this cabin, in this valley, with this man and their daughter and their pack of loyal wolves, Clara had found something worth more than safety. She had found home, and she would never let it go. The summer faded into autumn, and with it came the slow settling of peace over the mountain valley. News trickled up from Copper Ridge in fragments. Caleb Rourke had been tried and convicted of attempted murder, his father's wealth and influence insufficient to buy his freedom from a judge who had witnessed the truth with his own eyes. The elder Rourke, humiliated and broken by his son's imprisonment, had retreated to his ranch and stopped making threats. The townspeople who had joined the posse returned to their ordinary lives, most of them ashamed of how easily they had been manipulated. Clara learned all this from a trader named Willem, a weathered Dutch immigrant who had been making supply runs to the mountain communities for 20 years. He arrived one crisp September morning with flour and coffee and news, his wagon creaking under the weight of goods destined for the scattered homesteads throughout the territory. "You've become something of a legend, Mrs. Drake," Willem said, accepting a cup of coffee with calloused hands. "The woman who tamed the mountain man, the wolves that attacked a posse." Stories like that spread far and wide. Clara glanced at Harlan, who was sitting on the porch with Hope in his arms, pretending not to listen. "I didn't tame anyone, and the wolves were protecting their pack." "That's not how they tell it in town." Willem's eyes twinkled with amusement. "They say you're a witch, some of them, that you've enchanted Drake with dark magic, that you command the wolves with your mind." "And what do you say?" Willem looked at her for a long moment, taking in the strength in her posture, the peace in her eyes, the way her gaze kept drifting to her husband and child. "I say you're a woman who found where she belongs. Nothing magical about that, except in the way all love is magic." Clara smiled, touched by the old trader's wisdom. "Will you stay for dinner? We have plenty." "I'd be honored." That evening, as the sun painted the mountains gold and the wolves sang their twilight chorus, Clara sat on the porch with her family and their guest, watching Hope try to grab Shadow's tail while the patient wolf endured the indignity with stoic grace. The conversation flowed easily, stories of the territory, news from distant settlements, the small dramas and triumphs of frontier life. For the first time in months, Clara felt truly at ease. After Willem left the next morning, his wagon lighter and his belly full, Harlan found Clara standing at the edge of the clearing, looking out at the mountains that had become her world. "You're thinking," he observed, coming to stand beside her. "I'm always thinking. It's a curse." "What about this time?" Clara was silent for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "Willem called me a legend, said people are telling stories about us, the woman who tamed the mountain man, the wolves that fight for their pack." She turned to look at him. "Is that what we are now? Characters in someone else's story?" Harlan considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "People have always told stories about me. Most of them weren't true, or were true only in the way that fears are true, shaped by ignorance and distance." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "But the stories they're telling now about us, those have something different at their heart, something real. Love? Love. Family. The idea that monsters can be redeemed, that the wild places still hold room for happiness." He smiled, that rare expression that still made Clara's heart skip. Maybe it's not such a bad legend to leave behind. Clara leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder. "I never thought about leaving legends. I just wanted to survive. And now?" She looked out at the valley spread before them, the cabin they had built together, the garden that would sustain them through winter, the wolves that guarded their borders, the mountains that had sheltered them through storm and strife. "Now I want to live," she said simply, "really live. Not just surviving from one crisis to the next, but building something that lasts, something we can pass on to Hope, and maybe someday to her children." Harlan's arm tightened around her. "That's exactly what we're doing." "I know." She smiled. "I'm just now starting to believe it." The autumn deepened, bringing with it the rituals of preparation that Clara had come to love. They harvested the last of the garden, preserved meat for winter, gathered firewood until the pile reached nearly to the cabin's roof. Hope grew stronger every day, her gray eyes bright with curiosity, her tiny hands reaching for everything within grasp. Clara taught her the names of things: wolf, tree, mountain, sky. She sang to her the songs her mother had sung, read to her from the books that lined Harlan's shelves, held her up to the window to watch the wolves play in the meadow. And she marveled constantly at the miracle of this child who had come from love and would grow up knowing nothing but love. "She's going to be remarkable," Harlan said one evening, watching Clara nurse their daughter by firelight. "I can already see it." All parents think their children are remarkable. That doesn't make it less true. He came to sit beside them, his large hand gentle on Hope's head. She has your spirit, Clara, that fire that refuses to be extinguished. And she has my stubbornness, God help us all. Clara laughed. Heaven help whoever tries to tell her no. Heaven help whoever tries to take anything she loves. Harlan's voice had gone serious. She'll fight for what matters, just like we do. Just like you did, from the very beginning. Clara thought about that. About the frightened girl who had been sold in a saloon, about the woman who had faced down a mob with nothing but words and will. She barely recognized that girl now, buried under layers of strength and love and hard-won wisdom. I fought because I had something worth fighting for, she said quietly. You. Hope. This life. Everything I never knew I wanted until I had it. And now? Clara looked at her husband, at their daughter, at the cabin that had become her sanctuary. Outside, the wolves had begun their evening song, a chorus that had once seemed alien and now felt like home. Now I have something worth living for, she said, and I plan to live for a very long time. The first snow of winter fell on a November morning, soft and silent and pure. Clara woke to a world transformed, the mountains draped in white, the trees bowed under their frozen burden, the valley a pristine canvas unmarked by human passage. She dressed quietly, not wanting to wake Harlan or Hope, and slipped outside to stand on the porch and breathe in the crisp, cold air. Shadow was there, as always, and she pressed against Clara's legs with the easy affection of a creature who had chosen its family. Another winter, Clara murmured, scratching behind the wolf's ears. Our second together. Can you believe it? Shadow's tail wagged slowly, and Clara smiled. A year ago, she had been a stranger in this place, uncertain and afraid. Now she couldn't imagine being anywhere else. The door opened behind her, and Harlan emerged, Hope bundled in his arms. He came to stand beside Clara, and together they watched the sun rise over the mountains, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold. I used to hate winter, he said quietly. It reminded me of everything I'd lost. The cold, the darkness, the endless silence. And now? He looked at her, and his gray eyes were filled with something she could only call peace. Now, it reminds me of everything I've found. Clara reached for his free hand and held it tight. We found each other. Yes, against all odds, despite everything working against us. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed it, a gesture so familiar now, so precious. I would burn down every stone of this world to find you, Clara. I would tear apart the mountains themselves. You are everything to me, you and Hope. Everything. Tears pricked at Clara's eyes, but they were tears of joy, of gratitude, of love so deep it felt like drowning. I know, she whispered. I've always known. They stood together as the sun climbed higher, as the world woke around them, as another day began in their mountain sanctuary. Hope gurgled happily in her father's arms, reaching for the snowflakes that drifted down from the gray sky. Shadow watched it all with those knowing yellow eyes, guardian of a family she had claimed as her own. And Clara thought, with a certainty that filled her soul, this is what happiness feels like. Not the absence of pain or fear, but the presence of love strong enough to weather any storm. This is what I was born for. The winter months passed in their familiar rhythm, storms and stillness, darkness and light, the eternal cycle of survival that Clara had learned to embrace. She grew stronger in ways she hadn't expected, her body hardened by labor, her mind sharpened by the challenges of mountain life. She learned to navigate by stars when the landmarks were buried in snow, to find water when the streams were frozen, to track game when the hunting was lean. But more than survival skills, she learned patience, kindness, the quiet strength that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you're fighting for. Harlan watched her transformation with pride and wonder. You're not the woman I brought up this mountain, he told her one evening as they sat together by the fire. No? Clara looked up from her mending, curious. No. That woman was brave, but she didn't know it, strong, but she didn't believe it, beautiful, but she couldn't see it. He reached out and touched her face, his rough fingers gentle against her cheek. This woman knows all those things. This woman has grown into herself. This woman had help. Clara turned her head and kissed his palm. This woman had a teacher and a partner and a family. This woman did the hard work herself. Harlan's voice was firm. I could show you the path, but you're the one who walked it. You're the one who chose every single day to be here, to fight for this life, to love me even when loving me was dangerous.
Loving you was never dangerous, Clara smiled. Loving you was the safest thing I've ever done.
He pulled her close then, and she went willingly, settling against his chest as naturally as breathing. Outside, the wind howled and the wolves sang, but inside the cabin there was only warmth and peace, and the quiet certainty of two souls that had found their home in each other. Spring came late that year, arriving in fits and starts, winter reluctant to release its grip on the mountains. But eventually the snow began to melt, the streams began to sing, and life returned to the valley with all its color and chaos. Hope was nearly a year old now, crawling with fierce determination, babbling in a language only she understood. She had her first word, wolf, though it came out more like wuh, and she used it constantly, pointing at Shadow, at Gray, at any of the pack members who ventured close to the cabin. She's going to grow up thinking she's one of them, Clara observed, watching Hope try to follow Shadow across the clearing. Would that be so bad? Harlan was smiling, that rare expression that still made Clara's heart lift. Wolves are loyal, fierce. They protect their own. So do we. So do we, he agreed. Maybe that's why we all fit together so well. Clara thought about that as she watched her daughter play with creatures that should have terrified her, as she listened to the man she loved read Shakespeare in the evening light, as she felt the mountain breeze on her face and the solid earth beneath her feet. They were an unlikely family, a scarred mountain man, a woman who had been sold like property, a child born of impossible love, and a pack of wolves who had claimed them all. They didn't make sense by any conventional measure. They shouldn't have worked, but they did. Against all odds, through all trials, they worked. And that, Clara realized, was the real miracle. Not that they had survived, but that they had thrived. Not that they had found shelter, but that they had built a home. Not that they had escaped their pasts, but that they had created a future worth living for. One evening, as the sun set over the mountains and the wolves began their chorus, Harlan came to stand beside her on the porch. Hope was asleep inside, tired out from a day of exploration and play. Shadow lay at their feet, her eyes half closed in contentment. "What are you thinking about?" Harlan asked, his voice soft. Clara smiled, leaning into him. "I'm thinking about how lucky we are, how improbable this all is, how grateful I am for every moment. Even the hard ones? Especially the hard ones." She looked up at him, and her heart was so full it felt like it might overflow. "The hard ones taught me what really matters. They taught me who I am and who I want to be. They led me to you." Harlan was quiet for a moment, his arm around her shoulders, his gaze on the mountains that had witnessed their story unfold. Then he spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "I love you, Clara Drake. I will love you until the stars fall from the sky and the mountains crumble to dust. I will love you beyond death, beyond time, beyond everything that tries to separate us." Clara felt tears on her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away. "I love you too, Harlan. More than I ever thought I could love anyone. More than I have words to express." "Then don't use words." He turned her to face him, his hands cradling her face like something precious. "Just stay. Just be here with me for as long as we have." "Forever," Clara promised. "I'll stay forever." He kissed her then, soft and slow, a promise sealed in the fading light. And the wolves howled their approval, a wild song that seemed to bless this union, this family, this love that had defied every expectation. Clara Drake, who had been Clara Wynne, who had been nothing but a girl sold in a saloon, stood in the arms of her husband and knew, with absolute certainty, that she had found her place in the world. Not the place she had been born into, not the place others had tried to force her into, but the place she had chosen, fought for, and earned with every breath. Her place, her life, her love, and nothing would ever take it from her again. The years flowed like the mountain streams, sometimes rushing with urgent purpose, sometimes meandering in lazy contentment, but always moving forward, always carrying them towards something new. Clara watched her daughter grow from a crawling infant into a toddling child, from a toddling child into a fierce little girl who ran with wolves and climbed trees and asked questions about everything under the vast Montana sky. Hope Drake was 4 years old now, with her father's gray eyes and her mother's honey-brown hair, wild and untamed no matter how many times Clara tried to brush it into submission. She spoke in full sentences, read simple words from her parents' books, and had opinions about everything, especially about the wolves, whom she considered her siblings rather than pets. "Shadow is sad today," Hope announced one morning, pressing her small hand against the dark wolf's flank. "Her heart hurts." Clara looked up from the bread she was kneading, struck as always by her daughter's uncanny connection to the pack. "How do you know that, sweetheart?" "I can feel it." Hope's expression was serious, far too serious for a child her age. "She's thinking about before us." Clara exchanged a glance with Harlan, who had paused in his whittling to listen. They had told Hope the story of Shadow, how she had lost her mate, how she had been the omega of the pack, how she had found a new family with them. But they had told it simply, as a story, not expecting their daughter to understand the depth of grief that lingered in the wolf's yellow eyes. Yet somehow, Hope understood. "Then we should give her extra love today," Clara said gently. "That's what family does when someone's heart hurts." Hope nodded solemnly and wrapped her arms around Shadow's neck, burying her face in the dark fur. The wolf's tail wagged slowly, and something in her posture eased, as if the child's embrace had lifted a weight she had carried for years. Harlan caught Clara's eye and smiled, and she saw in that smile everything they had built together: the family, the home, the life that had seemed impossible that first night in the saloon. "She's remarkable," he said quietly, echoing words he had spoken years ago. "She is," Clara agreed. "She's exactly who she was meant to be." The cabin had grown over the years, expanding to accommodate their needs. Harlan had added a second bedroom for Hope, a proper root cellar for storage, a covered workspace where Clara could process herbs and medicines. The garden had doubled in size, and they now kept chickens and a milk cow in addition to the horses. It was a proper homestead now, not just a refuge. And they had neighbors. The Blackfoot people who lived to the north had always been aware of Harlan Drake, the white man who spoke to wolves and lived alone in the mountains. Some had feared him, others had respected him, most had simply left him alone. But after Clara's arrival, after Hope's birth, something had shifted. The elders saw in Harlan not a dangerous hermit, but a man who had found healing, and they began to extend gestures of friendship. First came gifts, beadwork, preserved foods, medicine bundles for Hope's protection. Then came visits, brief at first, then longer. Clara learned to communicate with the women through gesture and patience, picking up words and phrases, sharing her own knowledge of herbs and healing. By the time Hope was old enough to walk, she had playmates, Blackfoot children who came with their mothers to trade and visit, who taught her their games and showed her their ways. She grew up straddling two worlds, comfortable in both, belonging to neither completely but richer for the connection. "She's going to change things someday," Clara said one evening, watching Hope play with a Blackfoot girl named Singing Bird. "I don't know how, but I can feel it. She's going to make a difference in this world." "She already has," Harlan replied. "She's changed us, changed the pack, changed everyone who knows her." He pulled Clara close, pressing a kiss to her hair. "Our daughter is exactly the miracle we needed." The world beyond the mountains continued to evolve, sometimes touching their lives, mostly passing them by. The railroad pushed further west, bringing more settlers, more towns, more of the civilization Clara had once known. Telegraph lines crossed the territory. New laws were passed, new territories carved from the wilderness. But in their valley, time moved differently. The rhythms of nature governed their days. The migration of animals, the changing of seasons, the eternal cycle of birth and death and renewal. They lived simply, worked hard, loved deeply. And they were happy. Genuinely, profoundly happy. Clara thought about that sometimes, turning it over in her mind like a smooth stone. Happiness had seemed like such an impossible thing once, a luxury reserved for people with money and security, people who hadn't been sold by their own fathers, people whose lives hadn't been shaped by loss and betrayal. But she had found it here, in the most unlikely of places.
with the most unlikely of people. Happiness wasn't about circumstances, she had learned. It was about choice, about deciding, every single day, to embrace the life you had rather than mourning the life you'd lost. She had made that choice. Harlan had made that choice. And together, they had built something beautiful. The autumn that Hope turned 5 brought unexpected visitors.
Clara was gathering herbs at the edge of the forest when Shadow's warning growl alerted her to their presence. 2 riders approaching on the trail from Copper Ridge. Her hand went instinctively to the knife at her belt, her body tensing for flight or fight. But as the riders drew closer, she recognized one of them. Sheriff Thomas Grady looked older than she remembered, his hair gone completely gray, his face more deeply lined, but his eyes were the same, sharp, assessing, missing nothing. Beside him rode a young woman Clara didn't recognize, her dark hair pulled back from a face that bore the marks of recent crying. "Mrs. Drake," Grady tipped his hat as they reached the clearing. "I apologize for the intrusion." Clara didn't relax her guard. "Sheriff, what brings you this far from town?" Grady hesitated, and Clara saw something in his expression she hadn't expected. Uncertainty, perhaps even compassion. "There's news about your father." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. Her father. Samuel Wynne. She hadn't thought about him in years, had deliberately pushed all memory of him into a dark corner of her mind where it couldn't hurt her. "What about him?" Her voice came out flat, emotionless. "He's dead, ma'am. Passed 3 days ago in the charity ward at Helena." Grady shifted in his saddle, clearly uncomfortable. The doctor said it was his liver. Years of drinking finally caught up with him. Clara waited to feel something, grief perhaps, or satisfaction, or anger, but there was only a hollow emptiness, the absence of emotion where emotion should have been. "Why did you come all this way to tell me that?" Grady gestured to the young woman beside him. "This is Martha, your half-sister." The world tilted beneath Clara's feet. "I don't have a sister," she heard herself say. "You do now." Grady's voice was gentle. Samuel remarried about 4 years back, a widow in Helena. They had Martha here, and when Samuel started getting sick, he talked about you. A lot, apparently. Told Martha she had a sister in the mountains, that she should find you if anything happened to him. Clara looked at the young woman. No, the girl. She couldn't be more than 15, with their father's dark eyes and a trembling chin that spoke of fear barely contained. "I didn't know where else to go," Martha said, her voice small and scared. "Ma died of fever last winter, and then Pa got sick, and now there's nobody. The charity people said I could go to an orphanage, but I thought—" She trailed off, her eyes pleading. "I thought maybe I could find you." Clara stood frozen, her mind racing through implications and complications. A sister. A child, really, barely older than Hope. A connection to a past she had tried so hard to leave behind. "Clara?" Harlan's voice came from behind her. She turned to see him emerging from the cabin, Hope in his arms, his expression wary. "What's happening?" "It seems I have a sister," Clara said slowly. "Our father just died." Harlan's eyes went to Martha, assessing, calculating. Clara knew what he was thinking. Another person meant more resources stretched thin, more risk of discovery, more complications to their carefully constructed life. But she also saw the moment his expression softened, the moment he recognized in Martha the same lost, desperate girl Clara had once been. "You'd better come inside," he said gruffly. "The trail is no place for a child." They sat around the kitchen table, Clara and Harlan, Martha and Sheriff Grady, while Hope played with Shadow in the corner. Martha's story emerged in fits and starts, a childhood of poverty and instability, a mother who had tried her best, a father who had been absent more often than not. "He talked about you," Martha said, her eyes fixed on Clara. "Especially near the end. He said he'd made terrible mistakes, that he'd sold his daughter for gambling debts, that he'd never forgive himself. He cried sometimes, said your name over and over." Clara didn't know what to do with that information. The idea of her father feeling remorse, mourning his choices, crying over her name, it didn't fit with the monster she had constructed in her memory. "He was a weak man," she said finally. "Weak and selfish and cruel." "He was," Martha agreed quietly, But he was also my father, and he's dead now, and I have nowhere to go." The plea was unspoken but clear. Clara looked at Harlan, and something passed between them. A conversation without words, the kind of communication that came from years of loving and knowing each other. "You can stay," Clara heard herself say, "for as long as you need." Martha's face crumpled with relief and gratitude. "Thank you. Thank you. I won't be any trouble, I promise. I can work hard and help with whatever needs doing." "Your family," Clara interrupted gently. "You don't need to earn your place here." It was strange, claiming this girl as family. Strange, but not unwelcome. Clara had spent so long with only Harlan and Hope, had grown accustomed to their small, tight-knit unit. But looking at Martha, at her father's eyes in a stranger's face, she felt something unlock inside her. Forgiveness, perhaps, or at least the beginning of it. Sheriff Grady left the next morning, satisfied that Martha would be cared for. Clara stood on the porch and watched him ride away, then turned to find Harlan beside her. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. "I don't know." She leaned against him, drawing strength from his solid presence. "I never expected this. A sister. A piece of my father that isn't ruined. She seems like a good girl." "She does." Clara sighed. "I just hope I can be what she needs. I don't know how to be a sister. I barely know how to be a daughter." "You'll figure it out." Harlan pressed a kiss to her temple. "You always do." The weeks that followed were an adjustment for everyone. Martha was quiet and watchful, unsure of her place, desperate to prove her worth. Clara remembered that feeling, the terror of being a burden, the constant fear of doing something wrong. She tried to be patient, tried to show Martha the same grace Harlan had shown her. Hope, predictably, adored her new aunt. She dragged Martha everywhere, to the garden, to the wolf den, to her favorite climbing tree. She chattered constantly, filling the silence Martha seemed afraid to break, treating the newcomer like she had always been part of their family. "Your daughter is remarkable," Martha said one evening, watching Hope attempt to teach Shadow to roll over. "She is," Clara agreed. "She has a gift for seeing the good in everyone. Like you did, with me." Martha turned to face her, and Clara saw tears gathering in those familiar dark eyes. "I know what our father did to you. He told me near the end, told me everything, and I want you to know I'm so sorry. I know I can't make up for it, can't fix what he broke, but I'm sorry." Clara felt something shift in her chest, the last remnants of old anger loosening, falling away. "You have nothing to apologize for. You were a child. You had no part in his choices. But I'm still his daughter, still connected to him, to what he did. So am I." Clara reached out and took her sister's hand. "But that doesn't define us, Martha. We get to choose who we are, what we become. Our father made his choices and now he's gone. What matters now is what we do with the life we have left." Martha squeezed her hand, and Clara saw hope dawn in her expression. Real hope, the kind that had been absent for too long. "Do you really believe that?" "I do. I'm living proof of it," Clara smiled. "Now come on. Hope wants to show you the sunset from the ridge, and trust me, you don't want to miss it." They climbed together, Clara, Martha, Hope, and the ever-present Shadow, to the rocky outcrop where Harlan had once scattered Eliza's ashes. The sun was sinking toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple that seemed too beautiful to be real. "It's incredible," Martha breathed. "It's home," Clara replied simply. Hope squirmed between them, pointing at the colors, naming them in both English and the few Blackfoot words she had learned. Shadow sat at their feet, her yellow eyes reflecting the fading light, her presence a silent blessing on this gathering of souls who had found their way to each other. And Clara thought about the journey that had brought her here, the saloon in Copper Ridge, the terrifying ride into the mountains, the slow thawing of two wounded hearts. She thought about Harlan's patience, Hope's joy, the wolves' wild devotion. She thought about all the ways her life could have ended, all the paths that could have led to darkness and despair. Instead, she was here, surrounded by family, watching the sun set over mountains that had become her home. It was more than she had ever dared to dream. That night, after Martha and Hope were asleep, Clara found Harlan on the porch, staring up at the stars. She settled beside him, and they sat in comfortable silence for a long while, listening to the night sounds of the mountain. "Do you ever think about before?" Clara asked finally. "About who you were when we first met?" Harlan considered the question. "Sometimes. When I look at Hope, I remember what I lost. When I look at you, I remember what I found." He turned to face her, and his gray eyes were soft in the starlight. "I was so broken, Clara. So sure I would never be whole again. And then you came. And you put me back together, piece by piece, day by day. You did the same for me." Clara reached for his hand. "We saved each other, Harlan. That's what love does." "Is it enough?" The question surprised her. She hadn't heard that uncertainty in his voice for years. "All of this, our family, our home, our life, is it enough for you, or do you sometimes wish for more?" Clara thought about the question, giving it the weight it deserved. She thought about cities she would never see, adventures she would never have, a life of comfort and ease that would always be beyond her reach. "I have everything I need," she said finally. "A husband who loves me, a daughter who lights up my world, a sister who needs me, a home that shelters us all." She squeezed his hand. "What more could I possibly want?" "Nothing." Harlan's voice was rough with emotion. "That's exactly what I would say too." They sat together as the stars wheeled overhead, as the wolves began their nightly chorus, as the mountain wrapped them in its ancient embrace. And Clara knew, with the certainty that filled her entire being, that this was exactly where she was meant to be. Not because fate had decreed it, not because she had no other choice, but because she had chosen it, fought for it, earned it with every breath, every struggle, every moment of doubt overcome. The seasons continued their eternal cycle. Spring brought wildflowers and new life. Summer brought long days of work and play. Autumn brought harvest and preparation. Winter brought storms and the quiet intimacy of family gathered around the fire. Hope grew tall and strong, a wild child of the mountains who could track deer, speak 3 languages, and read Shakespeare by the time she was 10. Martha found her place in their family, her quiet strength complementing Clara's fierce determination, her gentle nature bringing peace to their home. The wolves aged alongside them, gray and moon growing slower, their muzzles going silver, their hunts less frequent. New pups were born, raised under Shadow's watchful eye, taught to accept the human family as their own. The pack endured, evolved, remained, and Clara and Harlan grew old together. It happened so gradually that Clara barely noticed at first. The gray creeping into Harlan's hair, the new lines around her own eyes, the way their joints ached on cold mornings. But when she looked back at the years that had passed, she saw them clearly, a lifetime of love, compressed into moments of extraordinary ordinary beauty. One summer evening, when Hope was 16 and Martha was 21, Clara sat on the porch and watched her daughters, both of them, for Martha had become as much her daughter as Hope, chasing fireflies in the meadow. Harlan sat beside her, his hand warm in hers, his presence as solid and comforting as the mountains themselves. "We did it," Clara said softly. "Did what?" "Everything." She gestured at the scene before them, the cabin, the garden, the wolves, the children. "Everything we dreamed of, everything we fought for. We did it, Harlan. We built a life." "We did." His voice was thick with emotion. "I never thought, after Eliza, I never thought I could have this again. But you proved me wrong. You proved me wrong every single day." Clara turned to look at him, at his weathered face, his gray hair, his eyes that still held the same depth of love they had held that first night when he'd carried her out of the saloon. "No one wanted to be the mountain man's wife," she said, echoing words from so long ago, "until I saw the truth of your heart. And no one thought I could love again." Harlan brought her hand to his lips. "Until you taught me how." They sat together as the sun set, as their daughters laughed in the meadow, as the wolves began their evening song. And Clara knew with perfect clarity that this was the ending she had always been searching for, not dramatic or tragic, but quiet and complete. A life well lived, a love well earned, a family well built, Under the endless Montana sky, surrounded by mountains and wolves and the people she loved most in the world, Clara Drake closed her eyes and smiled. She was home. At last and forever, she was home.